Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to meet your ancestors. Tonight, we travel more than 4 million years into the past to meet the first walker, Australopithecus AFARENSIS. This is part of our Human Origin series, a quiet exploration of how one small step began the story that became us. You're listening to Sleepless Homo, soft science and slow storytelling for sleepless minds. Here, we move through time gently, guided not by certainty, but by curiosity. Every fossil, every layer of earth, a whisper of what we used to be, now. Imagine the ground itself deciding to move, not quickly, not with noise, but with a slow, deep breath of the planet. Beneath the grasslands of what is now Ethiopia, Kenya and Tanzania, the crust began to stretch, fracture, and sink. It was as if Earth had grown restless with stillness. Over hundreds of thousands of years, molten rock pressed upward from the mantle, forcing the continent to split apart. That fracture would become the East African Rift Valley, a wound in stone that would open new lakes, lift mountain chains, and eventually shape the creatures that would one day call themselves human. If you were standing there 5 million years ago, you wouldn't see a sudden cataclysm. The world would look alive and calm, acacia trees scattered over open woodland, distant volcanoes breathing thin smoke into a copper sky. But beneath your feet, the crust was stretching, so slowly that only time could hear it. As the tectonic plates drifted apart, the eastern shoulder of Africa rose, forming a vast tilted plateau. Rivers changed course. Forests that had once been continuous became islands of green surrounded by widening corridors of grass. For an ape built for climbing, it was a dangerous gift. Geologists call this process rifting, and it's one of the quiet engines of evolution. The East African Rift is not a single crack, but a branching system that snakes for thousands of kilometres. In its earlier stages, it tore through a world already pulsing with a life. Ancient elephants, saber-tooths, and primates adapted to dense forests. When the land lifted, rainfall patterns shifted, the air dried, seasonal droughts grew longer. The dependable canopy, once offering food and safety, began to wither in patches. Trees retreated into valleys, leaving open ground between them. This fragmentation of habitat might seem like a minor inconvenience, but it changed the physics of survival. A primate that needed to cross open space for food, water, or safety had two options: stay on all fours and remain vulnerable, or rise briefly to scan the horizon. Each glance above the grass carried an advantage: spotting predators sooner, seeing fruiting trees in the distance, finding companions across the heat-shimmered plain. The ground itself was forcing vision to evolve. Climate scientists have tried to reconstruct those ancient rhythms using oxygen isotopes trapped in lake sediments and the dust that still lies buried around fossilized soils. They paint a picture of oscillating climate pulses, wet phases when forests returned, followed by abrupt, arid phases when they vanished again. This pattern repeated for millions of years. The rift acted like a biological tuning fork, pushing every creature to adapt, then adapt again. For an ape, stability was no longer an option. You either moved with the land, or the land moved on without you. Volcanism added another layer of instability. Eruptions blanketed the region with ash, poisoning streams but also fertilizing new grasses. Hills rose and eroded in geological breaths. Every few centuries a new eruption would redraw the map, shifting rivers and trapping valleys behind lava flows. These barriers isolated animal populations from each other, creating evolutionary laboratories on opposite sides of the same mountain. What began as geography became destiny. In that restless landscape, the first hints of bipedal adaptation appeared not as a conscious decision, but as a mechanical response to uneven terrain. Standing upright required balance, and balance required change. hips widening, spines curving, feet flattening into platforms of muscle and bone. None of this was planned. The rift simply punished those who could not move efficiently between forest patches and rewarded those who could. Every small step taken upright saved energy and opened new territory. It is easy, from our perspective, to see purpose in this, but there was no foresight, only feedback. Rain failed, lakes shrank, and the wind carried the scent of distant fruit trees across miles of heat. The apes that stood a little longer survived a little better. Evolution, blind and patient, did the rest. The scale of these shifts is hard to imagine. Over 1 million years, the valley floor dropped more than 1 kilometre, creating deep basins that filled with water whenever the rains returned. Great freshwater lakes appeared and disappeared like mirages. Turkana, Olduvai, Baringo. Each pulse of water attracted herds, and each drought scattered them. In this theatre of extremes, flexibility became the most valuable trait. The Rift Valley was not just shaping landscapes, it was sculpting behaviour. What makes this moment in Earth's history so haunting is that it was not unique to one species. The Rift Valley reshaped everything living within it. Antelopes lengthened their legs, elephants evolved new tusk shapes for stripping bark, and predatory cats learned to sprint. Yet among them was one lineage of apes whose changes would one day alter the entire planet. Not because they were strongest, but because they were curious enough to follow the horizon. Sediment cores from the Afar Triangle reveal that this cycle of aridity and renewal continued for millennia. Grasses spread during dry intervals, drawing grazing herds and indirectly their predators. When wetter conditions returned, forests expanded again, and the rift floor became a patchwork of life zones. This mosaic forced early primates into constant motion, climbing when trees returned, walking when they vanished. That motion was the crucible in which upright posture became not an option but a default. Geologically speaking, the Rift Valley is still being born. Even today, satellite imagery shows it widening by a few millimetres each year. Someday, millions of years from now, the African continent will split entirely, and a new ocean will flood the divide. It's a reminder that the same forces that once shaped our ancestors are still quietly working beneath us, rearranging the planet grain by grain. To understand humanity, we have to start here, not with tools or language, but with the ground itself. The East African rift created instability, and instability created imagination. In a world where the landscape could not be trusted to stay the same, the ability to predict, to remember, and to move became survival tools as real as any stone blade. When scientists walk the rift today, they can still feel that unease in the land. The hills are alive with geothermal vents, and the smell of sulphur mingles with the wind. Cracks widen imperceptibly underfoot. This is the Earth mid-thought, still revising its design. And it's humbling to realise that all of human evolution was seeded in such restlessness. Sometimes, in the silence between eruptions, the rift feels like a memory of the future, a place where creation and destruction are the same process, just seen at different speeds. The first step toward humanity was not taken on a savanna, but on a continent learning to divide. The Rift Valley taught balance long before we understood the word, and as we trace these deep fractures in stone, we're reminded that everything stable in our story began in movement. The very idea of standing upright, of seeing further, thinking further, was born from a planet unwilling to stay still. We are quite literally the children of a crack in the earth. If you enjoy learning like this, calmly, without noise or rush, consider subscribing or leaving a like. It helps other sleepless thinkers find their way back through deep time. And tell me in the comments, how do you listen? While falling asleep? While working? On a long night drive? If you drift off mid-story, there are timestamps below to help you return when you wake. Now. Let's step into the Rift Valley, where the ground itself was learning to walk, And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine a forest beginning to forget itself. The leaves still glisten after rain, but the rain comes less often. The canopy opens slightly at first, letting more light reach the ground, then more, until shadows become rare. Beneath the scattered trees the air grows hotter, drier, and full of restless insects. Streams that once murmured beneath vines fade into cracked gullies. The forest that once defined Africa's heart begins to break apart. Not in an instant, but in a rhythm of drought and recovery that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. What happens to a creature built for climbing when the trees that held its world start to vanish? Around 4 million years ago, that question was not metaphorical, it was ecological. Across East Africa, the ancient belt of continuous tropical forests began to fragment. Geologists and paleoecologists have traced this shift through the most patient archives nature keeps. Layers of dust, grains of pollen, and isotopes hidden in ancient soils. Each tells the same quiet story. The climate had begun to swing between extremes. Periods of abundant rainfall gave way to dry intervals where lakes shrank and savannas pushed into forest zones. Africa was becoming a continent of patches. To reconstruct this vanished world, scientists drill into ancient lake beds and river terraces, extracting long cylinders of sediment. Within those layers lie pollen grains from millions of years ago, perfectly preserved by mud and time. Under a microscope, each grain reveals the plants that once grew nearby. Forest pollen from fig, mahogany, and palm begins to thin out in these cores around this time, replaced by grains from grasses and shrubs that prefer open sunlight. That transition is the fingerprint of a dying canopy. At the same time, isotopic signatures in ancient soils, ratios of carbon-12 and carbon-13, record a similar change. Plants that rely on shaded, humid conditions, the so-called C3 plants, yield a different isotopic pattern than those adapted to drier, sunlit environments, C4 grasses. The shift towards C4 dominance in this period tells us the open grasslands were expanding. The forest was retreating into pockets where water still lingered. These weren't gentle transitions. In some valleys, dust storms scoured the land. In others, the return of rain flooded everything, creating temporary wetlands teeming with life. The creatures of the time had to live between these pulses. When the rains failed, they faced hunger. When they returned, they faced abundance, but also competition. The mosaic landscape that emerged wasn't a single ecosystem, but a shifting patchwork of woodlands, grass plains, riverbanks, and volcanic uplands. For every species that depended on trees, it was a challenge measured not in years, but in generations. Among the most telling witnesses of this change are the animals whose remains still lie buried in East African sediments. The bones of forest specialists, small antelopes, tree-dwelling monkeys, and leaf-eating browsers begin to decline in abundance. In their place appear grazers and mixed feeders, animals that could move long distances between food sources. The rise of open country fauna is a biological echo of what the pollen and isotopes already show. The ground was winning over the trees, even the insects left clues. Fossilised dung beetles and termite mounds from this period show adaptations to open, sun-exposed conditions rather than dense forests. Bird fossils shift as well, with forest-adapted species replaced by those that favour open savanna, like ground hornbills and bustards. It was not a single extinction event, but a slow reshuffling of an entire ecological orchestra. The drivers behind this change were as vast as the planet itself. Earth's orbit around the sun is never constant. It tilts and wobbles in cycles known as Milankovitch rhythms. These subtle shifts alter the distribution of sunlight between seasons, changing monsoon patterns. Around 4 million years ago, these cycles began to interact with the ongoing uplift of the East African highlands. As the land rose, it disrupted wind currents and pushed moisture-bearing air upward. causing rain to fall mainly on one side of the mountains. The other side, the Rift Valley floor, grew progressively drier. It was this collision between tectonics and orbital mechanics that made Africa's climate unstable enough to rewire evolution. If we could compress that geological slow burn into a single human lifetime, we might see forests vanishing before our eyes, animals migrating with each passing season, and fires creeping along the horizon at the end of every dry spell. For an ape living there, the environment was no longer a predictable home. Food sources moved, waterholes disappeared, and safety was no longer up in the branches. The world was forcing flexibility upon anything alive. It's easy to romanticize the savannah as a place of open freedom, but to a forest creature, it was exposure and risk. The tall grasses hid predators. The distance between trees made escape difficult. Shade itself became a resource, scarce, precious, and temporary. In the heat of the midday sun, survival meant timing every movement between shadows, just as much as finding food. Charcoal fragments preserved in ancient sediments tell us that wildfires became more frequent during this period. Lightning ignited the drying vegetation, and the flames reset the ecosystem again and again. Fire favoured grasses over trees, creating feedback loops that kept forests from returning to their former reach. After each burn, new shoots appeared quickly, drawing herbivores, and with them, carnivores. The cycle of burning and regrowth turned the rift into a living laboratory for resilience. These environmental swings also created corridors of opportunity. When forests retreated, the open spaces between them connected regions that had once been isolated. Populations of animals, and eventually hominins, could disperse, mix, and evolve in new ways. Then, as wetter phases returned, those same corridors closed again, isolating groups once more. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this dance of connection and separation produced both diversity and extinction. Nature was experimenting through space and time. If you stood there during one of the drier phases, you would feel the world breathing shallowly. Dust would hang in the air, muffling sound. Lakes would shrink to salt pans ringed by cracked clay. Trees, stripped of leaves, would rattle in the wind. Even the colours would change, deep greens giving way to muted golds and silvers. Then, without warning, a year of heavy rain could return, filling the same valleys with torrents, transforming the land into sudden jungle once more. To live in such a world meant learning to survive not a place, but a pattern. Scientists today try to capture this rhythm through the fossils of tiny freshwater mollusks and diatoms, the microscopic algae that once floated in ancient lakes. Their shells record chemical signatures of water salinity and temperature, revealing how rapidly lakes expanded and contracted. The evidence shows that these shifts sometimes happened within mere centuries, fast enough to challenge even the most adaptable species. The pace of environmental change, not just its scale, was accelerating. When the trees forgot to rain, they also forgot to protect. In the old forests, the canopy moderated temperature, sheltered the ground from wind, and trapped humidity. Without it, the soil dried faster, decomposers struggled, and nutrient cycles faltered. The energy of sunlight now hit the ground directly, fueling grasses but exhausting moisture. The land became both more alive and more fragile. And yet, within this turmoil, new forms of cooperation and opportunism arose among the animals. Herds moved in sync with the seasons. Birds followed the herds, feeding on insects stirred by their hooves. Scavengers learned to patrol dry riverbeds where carcasses accumulated. In every niche, life adjusted, not perfectly, but persistently. The ecosystem was teaching its inhabitants how to live in flux. From a modern perspective, it's tempting to see this as the moment the savannah arrived. But that would simplify what was really a long equilibrium between forest and grassland, a spectrum of microhabitats, each responding differently to rainfall and elevation. Some valleys stayed green even through droughts. Others turned to dust after a single failed season. The creatures that would someday define the human line were learning to navigate this complexity, to find paths between scarcity and abundance, danger and shelter. When scientists walk the rift today, they still find the traces of that lost transition. In the soil chemistry of ancient floodplains, and the pollen buried beneath modern grass, in the faint layering of volcanic ash, the story repeats itself. Forests thinning, savannas spreading, and life adapting to the in-between. The forest did not vanish completely. It simply moved aside, making room for something new to evolve. The most profound lesson in this period is not about disappearance, but about flexibility. Evolution thrives not in comfort, but in instability. The apes who once clung to branches were forced to test the open ground not by choice, but by necessity. The world was no longer a closed canopy. It had become a map of shifting opportunities. To survive here meant to watch the sky as closely as the soil, to sense rain before it fell, and to remember where the last green leaves still grew. We do not know all the details. The record is fragmentary, the timelines uncertain, the boundaries between wet and dry phases blurred by the chaos of erosion and volcanic dust. But every core sample, every isotope, and every fossil agrees on one point. The Earth was changing its rules, and life was listening. When the forest forgot to rain, it didn't end a chapter of evolution. It began a conversation. Between the sky and the soil, between roots and hooves, between instinct and adaptation. And somewhere in that silence between storms, the first faint rhythm of a new kind of movement began. The pulse of creatures learning to cross the spaces where trees once stood. Imagine a creature balanced delicately between worlds. Its hands still knew how to grip bark, its shoulders still carried the memory of branches, but its legs had begun to tell a different story. Somewhere around 4 million years ago, in the fractured valleys of East Africa, bones were quietly learning a new geometry. Evolution was rearranging an ape's architecture, rotating posture and purpose by 90 degrees. It didn't happen with intent or drama. It happened in the silence between steps, written into the slow arithmetic of bone growth and muscle tension. Each small shift in angle, each remodeled joint, brought a lineage closer to standing upright and closer to everything that would follow. The anatomy of walking is an engineering masterpiece, though no engineer designed it. To move efficiently on two legs, an organism must solve problems of balance, energy and stability all at once. The spine must curve to bear weight, the pelvis must shorten and broaden to support internal organs, the knees must angle inward to keep the body's centre of gravity aligned. None of this existed in earlier apes. Their skeletons were built for climbing, long arms, narrow hips, flat feet, and a centre of gravity that worked only among trees. The shift to the ground demanded an entire reorganisation of form. The first clue to this transformation lies in the pelvis. In quadrupeds, the pelvis is long and narrow, built as a hinge for forward motion on four limbs. But in the early ancestors of humans, this structure shortened and widened into a bowl shape. That bowl became the platform of bipedalism. It supported the gut against gravity, anchored powerful gluteal muscles for upright posture, and turned the lower body into a counterweight for the torso. The reorientation of the ilium, the broad flaring bones on each side, brought the muscles that once lifted the leg to the side now around to stabilise the trunk when walking. Without that rotation, every step would have been a fall. Below the pelvis, the femur tells the next chapter. The upper leg bone angles inward from the hip toward the knee, forming what scientists call the valgus angle. In apes that move on all fours, the femur hangs straight beneath the body, but in bipedal walkers it tilts so that the knees come closer together. This alignment keeps the body's weight centered over a single supporting foot during each stride. It's a small geometric trick, but it transformed energy use. Instead of swinging from side to side, wasting motion, these early bipeds could walk in a nearly straight line, each step conserving momentum for the next. The knee joint itself also changed. The surfaces of the femur and tibia expanded, thickened, and developed asymmetrical condyles, curved regions that distribute pressure differently across the inner and outer parts of the joint. This adaptation allowed the knee to lock briefly during each step, reducing muscular effort. It's why humans can stand for long periods without collapsing in exhaustion. For a species that once spent its days clinging to trunks and leaping between branches, this was an entirely new relationship with gravity. Then there is the spine, a column of bones that had to learn flexibility without fragility. Earlier apes had a single gentle curve suited to a horizontal posture. In these early bipeds, the spine developed multiple curves, a lumbar lordosis that arched inward at the lower back, and a cervical curve near the neck. These bends reposition the torso above the pelvis and head, creating balance while allowing shock absorption with every step. It was the silent evolution of posture. At the top of this new frame, the skull joined the transformation. In quadrupedal animals, the foramen magnum, the hole through which the spinal cord exits the skull, sits near the back, because the head extends forward from the spine. In upright species, it moves toward the centre of the skull's base, aligning directly over the vertebral column. This tiny shift allowed the head to balance above the spine rather than hang in front of it. The result was less strain on neck muscles and an entirely new perspective on the world. When the head tilts upright, vision changes, and so does awareness. The horizon becomes the default view. Each of these modifications required evolutionary compromise. A shorter pelvis made childbirth more difficult. An S-shaped spine increased risk of back pain and herniated discs. Bipedalism was not a perfect solution. It was a trade-off, but it paid enormous dividends in energy efficiency. Walking on two legs uses roughly a quarter of the energy of knuckle walking over the same distance. In a landscape where food and water were scattered, that efficiency meant survival. Fossilized fragments from this period tell us that these changes were well underway by around 4 million years ago. Hip bones from sites in Ethiopia and Kenya reveal the classic bowl shape, while femurs show the characteristic inward angle. These features suggest that by this time, walking upright was not an occasional behaviour, it was habitual. The forests had receded, and evolution had chosen balance over height. Even the feet were adapting to a new role. Though still flexible enough to grip branches, the toes were shortening, and the big toe was drifting into alignment with the rest. The arch, still subtle at this stage, began to form, storing and releasing energy like a spring with every step. The ankle joint became more robust, allowing both propulsion and shock absorption. Together, these changes turned a climbing foot into a platform for endurance. One of the most elegant consequences of bipedal posture was the liberation of the hands. But in this moment of prehistory, that potential remained latent. The hands were free, but they had not yet learned purpose. The bones below the waist were solving physics. The ones above had yet to discover imagination. When scientists reconstruct these skeletons in museums, the posture can look awkward to modern eyes. Hips slightly wide, arms long, the gait uncertain. But these bodies were masterpieces of adaptation to a shifting world. They could still climb when necessary, yet walk efficiently across open ground. They were not fully of the trees nor fully of the plains. They were the in-between experiment that worked. What makes this period extraordinary is not that one species suddenly learned to walk, but that the planet itself was sculpting posture through pressure and time. Every bone is a record of compromise between stability and motion. The pelvis tells of balance, the knee of endurance, the spine of resilience. Even without names or faces, the skeletons whisper how life negotiated gravity in a new way. To study these fossils is to realize that evolution often proceeds through constraint. The body doesn't start from scratch. It remodels what it already has. The pelvic shape that once supported sideways motion was twisted into a load-bearing bowl. The limb proportions that once swung from trees were recalibrated for ground stride. Bipedalism emerged not from invention, but from improvisation. Modern biomechanics has confirmed how efficient this design became. When researchers model early hominin locomotion in laboratories, they find that even primitive bipeds could walk at nearly the same energetic cost as modern humans at moderate speeds. The physics of stride length, joint rotation, and pendulum-like leg swing show a surprising optimization. Evolution had achieved functional elegance long before the brain caught up to notice it. There's also a subtle cognitive implication hidden in these bones. Walking upright demands not only balance but constant micro-adjustment, feedback from the inner ear, eyes and muscles all working together. The neural circuitry for that coordination overlaps with regions later used for planning and anticipation. It's possible that the shift to upright locomotion didn't just change how our ancestors moved, but how they thought. To walk is to predict the next step before it happens. Still, there are gaps in what we know. Fossils are incomplete, often distorted by compression or erosion. Reconstruction requires educated guesswork, aligning fragments into a plausible framework. Scientists debate angles and curvatures measured in millimeters. But across all interpretations, the story remains consistent. These early bipeds were stable, adaptable, and deeply committed to upright life. When you imagine one of them walking, picture not a clumsy ape wobbling across the savannah, but a body in quiet negotiation with physics, every joint adjusting, every muscle remembering millions of years of trial. Standing upright was less a triumph than a truce between evolution and environment. And perhaps that's the most humbling part of all. Our posture, something we take for granted, is not a mark of superiority but of survival. Each curve of the spine, each angle of the hip, each arc of the foot was earned through pressure and scarcity. The act of standing today is an echo of ancient balance, perfected by need, not by design. What we call humanity began as a structural problem. The solution was not strength or speed, but equilibrium. A creature learned to balance its skull on its spine, its body on its legs, its life between two worlds, and from that balance came the freedom to see further. Imagine the first time an ape lifted its head and the horizon stayed still, no longer a tangle of branches and shifting leaves, but a vast open line dividing earth and sky. Somewhere between 4 million and 3.6 million years ago, a subtle rotation within the skull changed the entire relationship between body, vision, and world. The act of standing upright was already extraordinary, but what followed was even stranger. The head had to learn how to balance in this new alignment. Evolution was not just teaching the body to walk, it was teaching the senses to reorient themselves in a landscape that stretched farther than any forest canopy had ever allowed. When an animal becomes bipedal, the mechanics of sight, sound, and balance all rewrite themselves. The skull, once tilted forward for a life spent scanning the ground and canopy, must now find equilibrium atop the vertical column of the spine. This is achieved through a small but decisive shift. The foramen magnum, the hole through which the spinal cord enters the skull, moves forward. In apes and quadrupeds, it sits near the back, allowing the head to project outward. In Australopithecus AFARENSIS, it had slid toward the centre, placing the skull directly over the body's axis. The result was an entirely new posture of attention. From this vantage point, the eyes faced the horizon instead of the ground. The field of view doubled in range, extending across grasslands and distant trees. For the first time in our lineage, the world could be read in depth rather than density. In a forest, awareness is about proximity. Branches, leaves, and movement within arm's reach. On the open plain, awareness becomes projection. What's moving out there? What glimmers? What shifts in the distance? Vision turned from reactive to anticipatory. The world widened, and the mind followed. This change also demanded new balance systems. The inner ear, with its semicircular canals responsible for sensing acceleration and orientation, had to adjust to a vertical frame. In earlier apes, these canals were tuned to arboreal motion, swaying, leaping and rolling through branches. In upright walkers, they became more symmetrical and slightly larger, optimized for detecting side-to-side and forward-backward motion while walking. Each step created a gentle oscillation of the head, and the vestibular system learned to stabilize it, keeping the eyes level and focused even as the body moved below. This neurological recalibration was crucial. Without it, upright vision would blur with every stride. The spine below played its part in this symphony of alignment. Its S-shaped curvature acted as both spring and stabilizer. The lumbar curve bent inward to bring the upper body over the hips, while the cervical curve at the neck balanced the head directly above the center of gravity. This delicate geometry allowed the head to stay steady while the rest of the body shifted rhythmically beneath it. Each vertebra, each interlocking facet joint, became part of a vertical engineering solution, refined by millions of micro-adjustments over generations. For Australopithecus AFARENSIS, these anatomical details meant survival. A stable, upright head provided not only better vision but also better hearing and smell directionality. The ears, positioned symmetrically, could now triangulate sound across an open field with greater precision. Predators that once approached unseen in dense forest were now audible and visible across distance. The landscape became not just a place to move through, but a field of awareness to interpret. And with that awareness came a shift in how the brain processed space. The visual cortex of these early bipeds was proportionally large relative to skull size, suggesting that depth perception and motion tracking were central to their lives. To see from the height of a standing body meant seeing differently. Shadows stretched longer, colour gradients softened, and the contrast between sky and earth became sharper. Every environmental cue, wind-bending grass, light flickering across movement, became information. Evolution was quietly training a lineage to think in distance and time, not just in touch and immediacy. The face too began to reshape around this new posture. The jaw retreated slightly under the skull, reducing the forward thrust typical of earlier apes. This repositioning balanced the head's weight over the neck, reducing muscular strain. It also changed the center of visual focus. Eyes no longer aimed downward, but forward. This frontal gaze is not merely mechanical. It alters perception itself. An upright creature that looks outward begins to define space relationally. Self here, world there. Awareness of distance may have been the first whisper of self-awareness. Even breathing and circulation adjusted. In a vertical body, the heart pumps blood against gravity to reach the brain. This required vascular and pressure adaptations that stabilized oxygen delivery in a head held high. The diaphragm's movement during walking further enhanced cooling and endurance. Upright posture thus connected mechanics with metabolism. Seeing farther also meant walking farther, and walking farther required a head that didn't overheat, blur, or lose balance. When paleoanthropologists examine cranial fossils from this era, they find evidence of all these subtle transformations. The base of the skull tilts downward, the neck opening shifts forward, the occipital region flattens slightly, and the orientation of the semicircular canals suggests a head designed for upright equilibrium. It's a reconstruction that makes evolutionary sense when mapped onto the environmental record. As forests receded and savannas expanded, being able to spot danger, food, or shelter across wide distances became essential. Natural selection favoured those whose heads stayed still enough to see clearly while moving. From an experiential standpoint, this must have changed what world meant. Imagine a primate standing on a ridge at dawn, seeing the first sunlight stretch over grassland. The horizon line, once abstract, becomes a place to navigate toward. Height gives context. For the first time, distance becomes a measurable, traversable thing. The simple act of looking up introduced a cognitive scale that no tree canopy could provide. It's possible that this vertical perspective seeded later instincts for orientation, knowing direction, remembering landmarks, forming mental maps. Balance in this sense was more than physical. It was perceptual. The integration of visual, vestibular, and proprioceptive systems, how the body knows its own position, created a constant feedback loop between motion and awareness. Each step required predicting instability and correcting it before falling. The neural precision for that might have laid groundwork for complex timing and coordination in later behaviours, throwing, tool use, even speech rhythms. Evolution was building a mind by refining a body's balance. There's also the matter of fear. To stand upright is to become visible. A 4-foot-tall creature walking across grasslands exposes itself to predators that once hunted unseen. Yet height also grants foresight, the ability to notice threat before it arrives. This trade-off may have driven new forms of alertness. Constant scanning, pattern recognition, an emerging sense of watchfulness. The upright head didn't just see more, it learned to anticipate. The reshaping of the skull thus represented a convergence of mechanical necessity and sensory opportunity. With each generation, small advantages in head alignment would have compounded. Better stability meant clearer sight. Clearer sight meant safer movement. Safer movement meant more offspring. Evolution didn't intend intelligence, but the pathway it forged through anatomy created the preconditions for it. To hold the head upright was to begin seeing as a strategist, not just as a survivor. Scientists studying modern human locomotion note that walking upright is fundamentally a controlled fall, each step a brief imbalance corrected just in time. The same principle applies to the head. The vestibular system constantly predicts where gravity will pull and adjusts before the fall occurs. In this continuous loop of prediction and correction lies a form of primitive foresight. Perhaps thinking itself evolved from this rhythm, the body's ongoing rehearsal for what's about to happen next. When we look at the fossil skulls of Australopithecus AFARENSIS, we see more than bone. We see the hinge between instinct and anticipation. The face still carries the strength of an ape, but the gaze has shifted. The neck supports weight vertically, not horizontally. The equilibrium that once stabilised climbing now stabilises movement through open air. The brain inside that skull was still small, roughly a third the volume of ours, but it was oriented differently, pointed toward a world that demanded longer attention spans and wider perspectives. In a way, the entire planet was reshaping perception. The same tectonic forces that split the Rift Valley and dried its forests were also crafting creatures able to navigate the new openness. The alignment of the skull, the curvature of the spine, the tuning of the ear, all were expressions of Earth's changing climate written into anatomy. To lift the head was to respond to geological time. When you stand outside today and look at the horizon, you're performing the same act perfected by those early ancestors. The balance between skull and spine, the quiet calibration of inner ear and vision, the instinct to steady yourself against wind or slope, all of it is ancient inheritance. Every moment you turn your head without falling, evolution's patience is at work. We often think of intelligence as something that begins in the brain. But here, long before language or tools, it began in posture. Awareness required stability. Balance required foresight. Seeing required standing. And standing required bones that trusted the pull of gravity enough to meet it halfway. So when the first head tilted forward and the horizon held steady, it wasn't just a mechanical achievement. It was the start of consciousness widening. The world got bigger because the body learned how to look at it. And from that moment on, our lineage would never stop raising its gaze. Imagine this. A quiet afternoon, long before memory, when the air was heavy with volcanic dust and the sky still carried the scent of rain. Across a thin crust of cooling ash, 3 shadows moved in single file. Each step pressed gently into the earth, leaving behind not bones or tools or language, but the rhythm of motion itself. Then the wind shifted, the ash hardened, and time began to forget, except the ground did not. What we now call Laetoli is less a place than an echo, a landscape that remembered something no skeleton ever could, how it felt to walk as if walking had always belonged to you. Around 3.7 million years ago, northern Tanzania lay within the rifted spine of East Africa, a land of open woodland and grass, dotted with the low silhouettes of acacias and occasional steaming vents from active volcanoes. The region sat near a chain of volcanic peaks, one of which, now eroded to near invisibility, erupted in a pulse of fine-grained ash. The particles settled like powder snow, coating everything in pale grey. Within hours, or perhaps days, a brief rain fell. The surface moistened, turning the ash to soft mud, sticky enough to capture shape, but delicate enough to record movement. Then the clouds broke, sunlight returned, and the earth began to dry again. It was during this narrow window, perhaps just a few hours in all of deep time, that 3 early bipeds walked across the wet plain, unaware that each step would be preserved longer than their species itself. The path they left stretched for roughly 30 metres, crossing the ash at a shallow angle. 2 individuals walked side by side at first, then one veered slightly, following in the other's footprints. A smaller set of steps joined them briefly, almost playful in its closeness, before fading away. When the prints were discovered millions of years later, the pattern was instantly recognisable to us, not as some abstract mark of movement, but as the language of our own gait written into stone. Heel first, then the ball, then the toes pushing off, the body transferring weight from one leg to the other in a steady rhythm that feels, even today, like breathing. To walk upright is not just a mechanical act. It is a dialogue between balance and gravity. What the Laetoli footprints show is mastery of that dialogue. The impressions are deep at the heel, where the weight first landed, then narrow through the arch, where the foot flexed, and finally pressed forward at the toes, where the stride released. Each footprint sits slightly ahead of the last, aligned in a straight line, the hallmark of a pelvis and knee designed for efficiency. There is no splay of outward-turned feet, no drag marks, no hesitation. Whoever made them was walking smoothly, naturally, habitually. When scientists analysed the spacing between steps, they estimated a stride length consistent with a small-bodied creature, roughly 1 to 1.2 metres tall, but with a walking rhythm almost identical to ours. The pace was relaxed, around 1 metre per second, or what we might call a stroll. The smaller track set suggests a companion of shorter stature following close behind, possibly a juvenile. Yet beyond speculation about their relationships, what matters most is what those tracks say about anatomy. Every print confirms what bone alone can only imply. These beings were fully upright walkers, not occasional experimenters in bipedality. The ground itself testifies that by this point in evolution, walking was no longer adaptation in progress. It was adaptation fulfilled. The preservation of such detail borders on miraculous. Volcanic ash, composed of fine silicate particles, acts as both canvas and fossilizing agent. When wet, it takes impressions with exquisite precision. When it dries, it can harden into a natural cement. A second, thinner layer of ash soon blanketed the first, sealing the footprints from erosion. Over the millennia, minerals infiltrated the hardened mud, turning it into rock. What began as a fragile trace of movement became a geological artifact, a negative mould of motion that outlived continents shifting and climates collapsing. If you were to stand at Laetoli today and look down at those footprints, you would be gazing into one of the most intimate records in the history of life. Bones tell us what a creature was capable of, but footprints tell us what it actually did. They record weight, momentum, intention, the way a living body negotiated the ground. The Laetoli trackway reveals even subtle asymmetries. The left foot pressing slightly deeper, perhaps favouring one side, or a momentary pause when the smaller individual stepped closer, leaving an overlap of prints. For a brief interval, we can reconstruct not just anatomy but behaviour, not just form but presence. Imagine the world around them in that moment. The ash fields stretched quiet and grey, the air still tinged with sulphur from the eruption. Small herds of grazing animals may have crossed nearby, their lighter footprints now lost to wind. The soundscape would have been muffled, each step sinking into dust. Heat shimmered over the valley floor, and in the distance the faint crackle of cooling lava echoed across the hills. Yet here, 3 beings walked calmly, unaware that they were writing the earliest surviving paragraph of human motion. The technical analysis of the prints reveals just how human that motion already was. The consistent heel-to-toe roll suggests a rigid arch, a structural feature that stores and releases energy during walking. The alignment of the big toe with the other toes indicates a foot specialised for propulsion, not grasping. This differs fundamentally from the divergent hand-like feet of tree-dwelling primates. The pressure distribution seen in the prints implies that their leg bones angled inward from hip to knee, balancing the centre of mass over a single supporting limb at each step. Such precision is the product of millions of years of fine-tuning between muscle, bone and ground. Some have compared the Laetoli footprints to those of modern humans walking barefoot in damp sand. In controlled experiments, the similarities are uncanny. The arc of the stride, the depth of the heel, even the curvature of the toes correspond closely. Yet one small difference remains. The prints are narrower and shallower, consistent with lighter bodies. They walked like us, but they were not us. The Earth recorded a ghost of our future form, an almost human rhythm echoing ahead of its time. From a geological perspective, the preservation of such transients is astonishing. Volcanic ash normally erodes quickly under rain and wind. Only a rare balance of timing and chemistry can lock it into permanence. The Laetoli eruption happened to coincide with a stable, arid period, followed by rapid burial. It was as if the planet itself conspired to keep this one moment safe. A time capsule not of bones or artefacts, but of footsteps, the most ephemeral thing life leaves behind. When these traces were uncovered in the late 20th century, researchers realised they were not merely impressions in stone. They were the oldest direct evidence of habitual bipedal walking on record. For decades, debates about early locomotion relied on skeletal inference, the shape of pelvises, femurs and spines. But the Laetoli trackway provided empirical proof. It showed motion itself, frozen in mid-stride. It confirmed that upright walking was not an experiment or an adaptation, limited to short distances. It was a way of life. If you study the prints long enough, you start to sense rhythm. The spacing between each step follows a cadence, one that your own nervous system instantly recognises. There's a strange familiarity in those fossilised paths, a muscle memory shared across millions of years. It suggests that the mechanics of walking, once perfected, hardly changed at all. From Laetoli to modern sidewalks, the pattern remains. Weight forward, lift, swing, fall, catch. A perpetual balancing act between gravity and intent. What makes these footprints haunting is their ordinariness. They do not record a hunt, a migration, or a dramatic escape. They capture something far quieter, a moment of simply being. Perhaps they were travelling toward water, or food, or shelter. Perhaps they were following a herd or returning from one. But there is no trace of struggle or panic, only continuity. That ordinariness is what connects us. To walk is to exist in motion, to commit to forward movement without seeing the future. Every step carries trust in the next. In paleontological studies, the Laetoli site continues to yield insights beyond its immediate trackway. Chemical analysis of the surrounding ash layers reveals the composition of volcanic glass and its interaction with rainfall, helping scientists date the event precisely. Pollen grains trapped within the same strata reconstruct the vegetation of the region, open woodland punctuated by grass, confirming that the walkers crossed a transitional landscape between forest and plain. Even microscopic air bubbles within the ash preserve the composition of the ancient atmosphere, a reminder that what hardened into stone was once living sky. There's also the question of why these tracks, and not countless others, survived. Tens of thousands of similar steps must have been taken across the same valley by animals of all kinds. Yet this one path endured. The reason is partly chance, partly chemistry, and partly timing. The volcanic ash at Laetoli had the right texture to take an impression, the right moisture to hold it, and the right burial sequence to preserve it. In evolutionary storytelling, it's tempting to read purpose into coincidence, but here we must remain humble. The ground kept what it could, and this is what it kept. What the footprints do not tell us is just as valuable as what they do. They say nothing about communication, emotion, or thought. They are silent on the matter of consciousness, and yet standing before them, one cannot help feeling presence. Not as myth or metaphor, but as a continuation of physics, the transfer of weight, pressure, and movement through time. These impressions are the dialogue between biology and geology, the brief moment when living flesh pressed against volcanic dust and the planet remembered. We often think of fossils as remnants of death. The Laetoli footprints remind us that sometimes what endures is an act of life. To walk away and leave a trace behind is the most human gesture imaginable. Perhaps that is why these prints resonate so deeply. They mark the beginning of our journey not as creatures defined by tools or language, but by motion, by the ability to keep moving forward through uncertainty. Next time you take a step, think about this. Your foot, too, transfers its story into the ground, a brief compression of soil, a momentary record of mass and direction. Most of it vanishes instantly, erased by wind or water or time. But somewhere beneath every surface, the earth remembers, however faintly, that something once passed by. The Laetoli footprints are proof of that memory. Fragile, accidental, eternal. The wind moving softly over a dry riverbed in northern Ethiopia, sunlight glinting on fragments of ancient bone half buried in sand. It is 1974, and a team of paleoanthropologists kneel in the dust of the Afar Depression, a place so barren that the ground itself seems older than time. One of them spots a curve of bone, small, weathered, but unmistakably part of something once alive, a fragment of the humerus here, a bit of pelvis there, and slowly, through the methodical patience of excavation, a partial skeleton begins to emerge. It is not just a skull or a femur this time, but a coherent body. The pieces are delicate, almost fragile, yet together they hold a kind of quiet defiance against oblivion. They will later be catalogued as AL288-1. But to the world she would become known as Lucy. What made Lucy extraordinary was not her completeness, but her incompleteness. About 40% of her skeleton was recovered, enough to reconstruct posture, gait and proportion, but not enough to tell a full story. Yet within that 40% lay evidence so precise that it reshaped everything we thought we knew about our lineage. The discovery site at Hadar, sitting along the Awash River, had once been a patchwork of lakes, floodplains and wooded savannas. Volcanic sediments layered the region like pages in a geological book, each one holding the residue of life and death spanning millions of years. Within those strata, Lucy's bones had rested for over 3 million of them, encased in silt and time. When the bones were first assembled in camp, the skeleton looked small, almost childlike. But measurements revealed an adult female standing roughly 1 metre tall, weighing about 28 kilograms. The skull fragments indicated a cranial capacity of just over 400 cubic centimetres, barely a third of a modern human's. Yet the pelvis, femur and tibia told a story that contradicted the size of the brain. This was a habitual walker, a creature built to stand and stride on 2 legs. The angles of the joints, the tilt of the pelvis, the alignment of the knee, all bore the signature of a biped that had already mastered balance. The pelvis in particular offered a revelation. Its broad bowl-like shape resembled that of humans rather than apes, providing support for internal organs during upright posture. The curvature of the iliac blades was rotated to anchor gluteal muscles that stabilized the trunk while walking. Even the shape of the sacrum, the base of the spine, hinted at a lower back capable of lumbar curvature. Each piece seemed to whisper a subtle truth. This body had learned to live vertically. The femur confirmed the story, its neck angled inward, bringing the knees closer to the midline of the body, aligning the centre of gravity over each foot in turn. The knee joint showed an expanded lateral condyle, adapted to bear weight efficiently during stride. Together, these features meant that Lucy's legs carried the hallmarks of a confident, balanced walker, not a hesitant climber testing the ground. Her arms, though, told a different tale. They were long in proportion to her legs, and her fingers curved slightly, relics of an ancestry still connected to the trees. She may have been comfortable both on the ground and among branches, yet her lower limbs had clearly taken on a new evolutionary commitment. In Lucy, we see the moment when climbing and walking coexisted, not as a contradiction, but as a transitional grace between 2 worlds. Her ribcage was conical, tapering upward like that of an ape, while her pelvis flared outward like a human's. That combination created a unique silhouette: narrow shoulders, broad hips, and a short, compact trunk. When paleo artists reconstruct her, they often underestimate how small she truly was. Standing beside a modern person, she would have seemed almost delicate. Yet this small frame bore the weight of millions of years of adaptation, balancing the physics of 2 modes of life, arboreal and terrestrial. The details of her vertebrae added still more nuance. The lower spine curved inward in a way that allowed the torso to balance above the hips. This curvature, the hallmark of bipedalism, reduced strain on the lower back and kept the head aligned above the body's vertical axis. Combined with her forward-placed foramen magnum, it showed that Lucy's head was held upright, facing the horizon, not tilted downward like her ape relatives. In the decades since her discovery, Lucy's skeleton has been studied, scanned, and reconstructed in countless ways. Every bone has been measured, every surface modelled. Her right humerus, for instance, bears slight asymmetries that suggest habitual use of one arm more than the other. Her teeth reveal a diet of mixed plant materials, fruits, roots, perhaps seeds, consistent with the wooded savannas of her time. The wear patterns on the molars hint at powerful chewing, a reminder that even as locomotion evolved, diet still tethered these early hominins to the ecological realities of survival. But perhaps the greatest impact of Lucy's discovery was conceptual. Before her, the fossil record of early human ancestors was scattered, isolated skulls, jaws, and fragments that hinted at bipedality, but offered no cohesive picture of the full body. Lucy provided that synthesis. Her skeleton demonstrated, beyond debate, that walking upright preceded the dramatic expansion of the brain. It overturned the 19th century assumption that intelligence led and locomotion followed. Instead, the evidence showed that posture and movement, the architecture of the body, were the first great revolutions of our lineage. The geological context of her burial adds its own quiet layer of meaning. the sediments of Hadar record alternating wet and dry cycles. Flood events would have carried silt and volcanic ash into low-lying basins, occasionally trapping the remains of animals caught by rising water. Lucy's final resting place seems to have been just such a basin, a river margin that briefly flooded, then sealed her remains beneath a protective layer of sediment. Over time, minerals replaced organic material, transforming her bones into stone. She became a literal bridge between biology and geology. Life turned into matter, preserved by the same processes that shaped mountains and valleys. Even so, we must remain humble in how we interpret her. For all her fame, Lucy remains incomplete, both physically and interpretively. 40% of a skeleton may sound substantial, but it leaves 60% unknown. The skull lacks a face, the hands and feet are partial, and no soft tissue survives to tell us about muscles, skin, or gait subtleties. Reconstructions of her appearance, her posture, her stance, even her expression, are built on educated inference. Science can approximate, but never resurrect. There's a humility in that limitation. Every generation of researchers remeasures her bones with better tools, new imaging methods, and more refined models, and yet the core questions remain. Exactly how did she move, and what did she see when she looked out across her world? Even after decades, no answer is final. Science accepts that uncertainty not as weakness, but as truth. Lucy is not a closed case. She is an ongoing conversation between evidence and imagination. What is remarkable is how much personality seems to radiate from the data despite the absence of story. Not mythic personality, not sentiment, but structural character. Her proportions, her engineering, her evolutionary balance convey determination without intention. She represents not herself, but a turning point in anatomy, the first nearly complete map of a body walking its way toward humanity. When you stand before her reconstructed skeleton in a museum, what strikes you is scale. She is smaller than you expect, yet eerily familiar. The pelvis, the knee, the tilt of the spine, all immediately recognizable. But the rib cage, arms, and skull belong to another world. It's as if two different evolutionary worlds are meeting halfway through her bones. The experience is humbling because it reminds us that we are not the pinnacle of anything, merely one of its latest experiments. The name Lucy came from a moment of levity amid the gravity of discovery. That night in camp, as the team celebrated with a small radio playing the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, someone suggested naming the fossil after the song. The name stuck, not because it carried scientific precision, but because it captured a rare moment of human warmth in the desert, a reminder that behind every fossil lies the curiosity of living minds trying to understand their place in deep time. In the decades since, Lucy has become both symbol and specimen, the most famous fossil of the genus Australopithecus AFARENSIS, a name that translates to southern ape of afar. Yet scientists resist the temptation to romanticize her. She was not the first of her kind, nor the last. She was one among many in a population scattered across the rift valleys of East Africa. What makes her exceptional is not uniqueness, but preservation. The coincidence of time, sediment, and discovery aligning to give us a clearer glimpse into what otherwise would have remained unknown. Even now, she continues to teach through absence. For all that her bones tell us, they also remind us of everything lost. The countless individuals who lived, walked, and vanished without leaving a trace. Fossilization is a miracle of probability, not a routine of nature. The vast majority of life disappears utterly. That Lucy endured is less an inevitability than an accident, one that allows us to touch the geometry of evolution directly. In that sense, her skeleton is not just a relic, but a reflection a reminder that identity in deep time is built from fragments. When we look at her, we are not seeing a person, but a collection of patterns that led, eventually, to us. The pelvis that balances, the femur that angles inward, the spine that curves, all of it echoes in our bodies now. She's not our ancestor by name, but by rhythm. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson Lucy still offers after all these years. Evolution doesn't hand us complete stories. It hands us pieces and asks us to listen. The bones of AL288-1 do not speak in certainty, but in suggestion. An invitation to imagine a world where standing upright was both ordinary and revolutionary. To see her is to see ourselves mid-transformation, caught between what we were and what we would become. What if I told you that Lucy was never alone? That her kind walked the earth not as a single species, but as one voice in a chorus of experiments? For a long time, we imagined a straight line of descent, one species giving rise neatly to the next, a tidy staircase of progress climbing toward us. But evolution was never a staircase. It was a tangle of roots, a living web, each branch testing its own version of survival. Around the time Lucy walked through the savannas of East Africa, other forms of early humans were also taking their first steps upright. Cousins, not descendants, shaped by the same environment, but tuned to different solutions. In the ancient sediments of Kenya and Ethiopia, bones and jaws tell us that from about 3.9 to 3 million years ago, the Rift Valley was home to at least 3, perhaps 4 distinct kinds of early hominins. Their fossils do not form a tidy sequence. They overlap in time and sometimes even in geography. Australopithecus AFARENSIS, Lucy's species, may have been the best known, but it was not alone. Evolution during this period seemed to be improvising. The earliest among them was Australopithecus anamensis, whose remains were found at sites like Kanapoi and Alia Bay, along the shores of an ancient lake in Kenya. The bones date back to around 4.2 to 3.9 million years ago, older than Lucy, yet strikingly similar. The tibia from anamensis shows a thickened plateau, the flat upper surface of the shin bone, shaped by the stress of upright walking. The ankle joint and knee bear the same weight-bearing adaptations seen later in Afarensis. Yet the jaw and teeth tell a more primitive story. A long, projecting face, thick enamel, and canines still larger than those of Lucy's kind. Anamensis stood at the threshold of a transformation. Part arboreal, part terrestrial. Its anatomy a compromise between trees and open ground. Some paleoanthropologists once suggested that Anamensis simply evolved into Afarensis through a smooth, linear transition. But recent discoveries complicate that picture. Fossils found at Warantso Mill in Ethiopia show that both species may have overlapped for nearly 100,000 years. If that is true, then evolution was not a baton pass from one runner to the next, but a coexistence. 2 slightly different ways of being bipedal tested side by side. Then, in sediments dated roughly to 3.5 million years ago, another unexpected face emerges. Kenyanthropus platyops, the flat-faced man of Kenya. Discovered near Lake Turkana, its crushed skull was puzzling. A broad, flat visage, small molars, and a surprisingly human-like facial structure unlike either Anamensis or Afarensis. For years, scientists debated whether this was a distinct species, or merely a distorted Afarensis fossil reshaped by geological pressure. But subsequent analyses of the sediments, along with high-resolution imaging of the fossil, suggest that its features were genuine. Kenyanthropus may have represented a separate lineage experimenting with different forms of diet and chewing mechanics, possibly even a different ecological niche. Its flat face suggests changes in how the jaw muscles attached, perhaps linked to a shift in the kinds of food it processed, or simply to random anatomical drift. The existence of Kenyanthropus reminds us how little we understand about early hominid diversity. In the same region and time frame, subtle variations in climate, vegetation and altitude could have carved small populations into distinct evolutionary paths. Where one group found survival in open woodland, another might have thrived along wetter river margins. Each species, through its posture, dentition and diet, was an answer to the same question asked by different environments. How does one stay alive on two legs in a world that keeps changing? And then, in southern and eastern Africa, another form appears, one with a wider jaw, larger teeth and a skull built for chewing. The earliest members of what we later call Paranthropus, the robust Australopiths. They are not direct ancestors of Lucy or of us, but rather an evolutionary side branch that specialised in a different direction. Their features, massive molars, flared cheekbones and powerful jaw muscles, suggest a diet dominated by tough, fibrous vegetation. While Lucy's kind balanced adaptability with mobility, these early robust forms were building fortresses of bone against the demands of hard living. The distinctions among these species are small in appearance but vast in implication. Anamensis shows us the persistence of arboreal heritage. Afarensis demonstrates refinement in upright locomotion. Kenyanthropus hints at facial and dietary innovation. Paranthropus foreshadows a lineage that would later vanish entirely. Together they form a mosaic, not a ladder, but a landscape of overlapping experiments. When we plot them on a timeline, the neat progression dissolves. From 4 million to 3 million years ago, multiple Australopith species shared overlapping habitats across East Africa. It's likely they occasionally encountered one another, perhaps not in competition, but in quiet parallel, each pursuing food, shelter and survival along its own path. To the untrained eye, they might have seemed nearly identical. But to evolution, the differences: a slightly longer leg, a broader molar, a flatter face, mattered immensely. Each difference was a bet on the future. The Rift Valley itself acted as both cradle and crucible for this diversity. Its shifting tectonics created a patchwork of ecosystems: highlands and lowlands, lakes and forests, dry plains and river corridors. As volcanic activity reshaped the terrain, populations became isolated, split and adapted locally. Over thousands of generations, genetic drift and natural selection produced variations that we now categorize as separate species. But at the time, there were no lines or names, only bodies adjusting to the tilt of the earth. Modern field work continues to blur the boundaries between these species. Fossils from sites like Laetoli, Alia Bay and Cubiphora reveal that attributes once thought unique to one form often appear in another. The evolutionary tree looks less like a trunk and more like braided roots, intertwining and diverging repeatedly. In that web, Lucy's lineage is just one strand, successful, but not inevitable. This realization reshapes how we think about evolution itself. For much of the 20th century, popular imagination treated human evolution as a story of improvement, primitive to advanced, ape to man. But the fossil record tells a subtler truth. Progress was never guaranteed. For every lineage that flourished, several others ended quietly, leaving only traces in stone. Nature did not plan for humans. It experimented endlessly, and most of those experiments vanished without legacy. If we could step back into that landscape, the rift valleys of 3 million years ago, we might see not one kind of early human, but several. Some shorter, some broader, some with faces more projecting, others with flatter skulls and different gaits. Each would have recognized the others, perhaps with wary curiosity, perhaps with indifference. They shared not language or culture, but the same fragile equilibrium between environment and adaptation. What's fascinating is how similar their challenges were. All had to find food across a landscape of shifting rainfall and vegetation. All faced predators larger and faster than themselves. All depended on the delicate mechanics of upright walking, the anatomical gamble that had already defined their future. Yet they expressed that adaptation differently, proving that even within the same evolutionary niche, there is more than one way to walk upright. In a sense, this diversity mirrors the broader pattern of life on Earth. When a new ecological opportunity arises, whether flight, swimming, or bipedalism, evolution does not produce one perfect version. It proliferates. It fills the landscape with variations, each one an attempt to refine the same principle. The early Australopiths were that explosion of possibility. They were life-testing new configurations of bone, muscle, and instinct, some of which would vanish, others of which would endure for millions of years. When paleoanthropologists reconstruct this era, they often describe it as a radiation, an evolutionary bloom. Just as finches diversified on isolated islands, so did these early hominins across the mosaic of East Africa. The fossil record from this period is frustratingly incomplete. Scattered teeth, partial jaws, bits of limb bone. Yet even those fragments show enough distinction to tell us that diversity, not singularity, was the rule. And so, when we imagine Lucy walking across Hadar, we must picture not a lonely pioneer, but one among many experiments in what it means to be upright. Her success was contingent, her form one among several competing blueprints. In another timeline, perhaps a flatter-faced cousin, or a broad-jawed relative might have endured instead, and the story of humanity would have taken an entirely different shape. This understanding forces humility upon us. We are not the inevitable outcome of evolution's plan. We are simply the last survivors of a vast branching story. Our existence depends on accidents of geography, climate, and time, no less than those of the Australopiths who vanished. The past is not a ladder we climbed, but a forest we barely navigated. And perhaps that is what makes this chapter in prehistory so compelling. It reminds us that being human is not about perfection, but persistence. In every fossil jaw, every fragment of limb, every species that rose and fell between 4 and 3 million years ago, we see evolution at its most creative and uncertain. The diversity of walkers then was not failure, it was possibility, the kind that nature never stops exploring. Imagine this. For the first time in history, a creature walks across the African plain with its hands not touching the ground. Fingers that once clung to bark now swing freely beside the body, no longer needed for balance or locomotion. The transformation is small, almost imperceptible, but it changes everything. For the first time, the hands are unassigned. They can hold, carry, gesture, and one day, create. Around 3.5 million years ago, in the dry mosaic woodlands of East Africa, evolution quietly untethered the upper limbs from the business of walking, and in doing so gave the body something far more profound than movement. It gave it potential. The story of bipedalism is often told from the waist down, about hips, knees, and arches. But the revolution that truly reshaped the future of our lineage began above the waist, when locomotion no longer dictated what hands could do. This anatomical liberation unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly. The earliest upright walkers still carried the imprint of their climbing ancestry. Long arms, curved fingers, strong shoulders designed for pulling. But as walking became more efficient, the upper limbs became less constrained by balance. The energy once spent bracing against gravity could now be directed toward action. Biomechanically, the shift was remarkable. In quadrupedal primates, the forelimbs bear a significant portion of body weight and stabilize motion. In early bipeds, that burden was transferred entirely to the lower limbs. The pelvis, femur, and spine formed a column capable of supporting the body's mass, with minimal muscular effort. This freed the scapula and clavicle, the shoulder girdle, to rotate more fluidly, enabling a wider range of motion. The hands, no longer pressed into the ground, began to evolve new capabilities. The wrist bones shortened and aligned, stabilizing the palm. The thumb, already opposable, gained precision through new joint angles. Evolution didn't invent new structures, it simply reallocated purpose. From a distance, this might seem trivial. But consider what this meant in a world of uncertainty. To walk upright meant to move efficiently, but to do so with empty hands meant to move equipped. Suddenly an early hominin could carry food, water, or offspring without sacrificing mobility. A mother could walk further while holding her infant, protecting it from predators or the searing ground. A scavenger could transport scavenged meat back to a shaded safety, rather than consuming it on the spot. A gatherer could collect fruits or tubers from scattered sources and bring them to a single place. In a landscape of fluctuating resources, the ability to carry meant the ability to plan. Anthropologists often refer to this as the transport hypothesis of bipedalism's advantage. Each step taken upright reduced the cost of movement, and when coupled with freed hands, it multiplied survival efficiency. It wasn't intelligence that first made humans adaptable. It was logistics. Energy saved by walking could now be invested in endurance, exploration, and cooperation. In this light, the free hand was not just a symbol of creativity. It was a tool of survival long before it ever shaped a stone. Fossil evidence supports this gradual repurposing. The wrist and hand bones of Australopithecus AFARENSIS reveal a curious blend of strength and precision. The metacarpals are thick, the fingers still slightly curved for climbing, yet the thumb's relative length and muscular attachment suggest increasing dexterity. The joint surfaces between the trapezium and first metacarpal, the bones forming the base of the thumb, show mobility similar to that of modern humans, enabling the pinch grip that would later define fine manipulation. This was not a hand that built tools yet, but one that could hold an object securely while moving, a hand capable of carrying. Imagine one of those early hominins crossing an open stretch of savanna, holding a cluster of gathered tubers or a cracked bone rich in marrow. The axiome's mundane, but in evolutionary terms it's revolutionary. Other animals use tools or carry objects briefly. Crows, chimpanzees, even some otters. But none do so while walking freely on two legs. In freeing the hands, the body rewrote the relationship between motion and mind. The energy efficiency of this new gait was another quiet advantage. Studies of modern human locomotion show that walking on two legs at moderate speed uses roughly 1/4 of the energy that quadrupedal primates expend when covering the same distance. Over a lifetime of foraging, that difference accumulates into survival. The ability to move farther with less effort meant new territories could be reached, new food sources discovered, new migration routes explored. The hands simply made that efficiency more versatile, enabling the transport of those resources once found. As these early walkers traversed increasingly variable environments, from forest to open plains, their mobility became their defense. A body balanced on two legs could stand taller to scan the horizon, spot danger earlier, and flee with essentials in hand. But it could also return to the shade of trees when necessary, climbing with the same arms that had carried food. Evolution did not abandon the past abruptly. It integrated it. The free hand was an evolutionary hybrid, still strong enough for the canopy, but ready for the plain. What makes this moment so fascinating is how it redefined what survival meant. Before bipedalism, a primate's safety depended on immediacy, eating where one found food, sleeping where branches allowed. Afterward, mobility created the concept of later. To carry was to anticipate. The earliest expression of planning may have been nothing more than taking something with you. That act alone marked a profound shift in behaviour. It implied foresight, even if only seconds ahead. Carrying also changed social dynamics. When individuals could move while transporting resources, sharing became possible in a new way. A piece of fruit or a scavenged bone could be brought back to others. The mechanics of upright posture, coupled with free hands, laid the groundwork for the cooperation that would later define humanity. This wasn't yet morality or empathy, just practicality. But in biology, practicality often builds the scaffolding for complexity. Even the simple act of carrying infants may have driven strong evolutionary pressure. Unlike quadrupeds, whose young can cling to fur or ride along the mother's back, a biped's infant must be held. The arms, now available for such a task, became instruments of care. This changed not just locomotion but life strategy. Mothers who could carry their young farther and more safely had higher reproductive success. Over generations, this behaviour could have influenced social bonding and even group structure. In that sense, the hand that once gripped branches now held the future directly. Biomechanically, freeing the hands also allowed subtle refinements in posture. Without the need to stabilise on all fours, the shoulders rotated laterally, expanding the range of motion in the arms. This rotation enhanced balance during walking by allowing a counterswing of the arms opposite the legs, which improved gait efficiency. It's a movement we still perform unconsciously today. The rhythmic pendulum of our arms, keeping our bodies steady with every step. What began as anatomy became rhythm. Over time, those same rotational freedoms would lay the foundation for throwing, tool use, and expression. But in this early phase, they served simpler purposes, carrying objects, balancing motion, and regulating heat by increasing airflow across the torso. Evolution is economical. Every feature tends to serve multiple functions. The free hand began as a physical adaptation, but it set off a cascade of consequences that would ripple through physiology, behaviour, and eventually cognition. In paleoanthropology, it's easy to be seduced by grand theories about intelligence, culture, and symbolism. But standing before these fossils, one must remember how quietly it all began. The profound often hides in the practical. The ability to carry a stone, a branch, or a child across distance required no genius, only new anatomy and the persistence to use it. Yet that persistence changed the world. The fossil record hints at this transition in other subtle ways. The shoulder joints of Australopithecus AFARENSIS were angled less upward than those of earlier apes, suggesting reduced emphasis on overhead climbing. The ribcage narrowed toward the top, shifting the centre of gravity downward for balance during walking. These changes, taken together, suggest a creature increasingly committed to life on the ground, yet still versatile enough to use trees when needed. The upper body was no longer primarily for suspension, it was becoming a system for manipulation. And with manipulation came feedback, a sensory dialogue between hand and world. The fingertips of primates are rich in nerve endings, allowing extraordinary sensitivity. Once the hands were freed from locomotion, those sensory channels could evolve toward precision. The brain, in turn, would gradually dedicate more neural territory to processing tactile input. The partnership between movement and perception deepened. Each time an early hominin carried, touched, or adjusted its grip, it was unknowingly refining the link between brain and body. This new freedom did not make life easier. The shift to walking on two legs came with trade-offs: vulnerability to injury, strain on the spine, and slower running speed. But evolution rarely trades up without cost. The gains in flexibility, reach, and efficiency outweighed the drawbacks. In the long run, the free hand would prove to be the greatest tool evolution ever shaped, though its first uses were simple and unrecorded. We will never know the exact moment when one of our ancestors realised the hand could do something other than walk. There was no spark of insight, no instant of revelation. It was simply a slow accumulation of utility, holding, lifting, carrying, repeating, until the act became instinct. What began as adaptation became habit, and what began as habit became opportunity. The first hand that reached for something did not change the world that day. but it changed what was possible. And from that possibility, from the quiet repurposing of bone and muscle, would emerge everything that followed. Tools, fire, art, writing, memory. All from the simple fact that one species learned to walk, and in walking, discovered that its hands were free. Imagine this. A small figure rising above the grass, blinking against the glare of an afternoon sun that stretches endlessly across the East African horizon. For the first time, eyes once used to tracing vines and shadows among trees now look outward, across open distance. There's no canopy to frame the world, no branch to mark the limits of motion, only light, wind, and space. Around 3.5 million years ago, in the middle of the Pliocene epoch, sight itself was changing. When the body stood upright, the eyes found a new relationship with the world. The horizon became both boundary and invitation, a stage on which anticipation was born. Vision is not only a window, but a prediction. In the world of early apes, depth and detail mattered within meters. Distance is short enough to leap or grasp. The eyes were tuned to near space, judging the thickness of branches and the position of fruit. But when the first bipedal hominins began to navigate open terrain, their visual needs expanded dramatically. The shift from canopy to savanna meant that seeing far became as vital as seeing clearly. The body's vertical rise lifted the head an extra metre above the grass, a small change that doubled the visual range. For a creature dependent on awareness, predators, water, movement, that difference was enormous. This transformation was not an overnight redesign, but an evolutionary recalibration. The position of the eyes within the skull, forward-facing like in apes, was already optimized for stereoscopic vision. That overlap of visual fields allowed depth perception, crucial for climbing. What changed was the context in which that ability operated. From tree branches to open plains, the eyes had to merge near-vision accuracy with long-range awareness. The neural pathways that processed motion, contrast and focus began to adapt to this dual demand. Fossil evidence from early hominins, such as Australopithecus AFARENSIS, suggests cranial features that supported this refinement. The orbits, the bony sockets housing the eyes, were positioned more frontally than in most quadrupeds, maintaining binocular overlap but allowing slightly elevated forward vision. The base of the skull, aligned with a vertical spine, tilted the head in a way that kept the horizon naturally level. This subtle geometry meant that when an Australopith stood upright, its field of view extended over the grasses, an evolutionary privilege that no arboreal ancestor had known. From this new perspective, the world must have seemed both vast and exposed. Predators, once hidden by foliage, could be seen from hundreds of meters away. Lions' ancestors, saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas. The open distance offered warning, but also responsibility. To survive in such terrain, sight alone was not enough. It had to be interpreted. The brain had to link what the eyes saw now to what might happen next. The horizon became not just a view, but a question. What moves there, and what will it do? In that question lay the beginning of foresight. The expansion of the visual field brought with it the mental capacity to imagine events before they unfolded. This wasn't yet conscious strategy, but the earliest stirrings of prediction, a cognitive adaptation built from perception itself. Each second of scanning the horizon trained neural circuits to detect subtle cues, movement patterns, changes in light, the approach of dust. To stand upright was to become a watcher of patterns. This awareness demanded new kinds of motion as well. The eyes, now stabilized by a more flexible neck and balanced spine, could fix on distant points while the body moved beneath them. The vestibular system in the inner ear synchronized with the visual cortex to maintain a steady gaze during walking. This coordination allowed early bipeds to move and look simultaneously, to walk toward what they saw without losing orientation. In evolutionary terms, it was a merger of stability and curiosity. The advantage was profound. Predators hunt by surprise, prey survives by seeing early. An upright stance, combined with wide-range vision, extended the warning window from seconds to minutes. It also expanded opportunity. A creature that could spot fruiting trees, carcasses, or water sources from afar could plan routes rather than stumble upon them. The eyes, once tools of immediacy, became instruments of navigation. Modern neuroscience hints at what this shift meant internally. The human visual system devotes nearly 1/3 of the brain's cortical area to processing sight, far more than any other sense. In our ancestors, this likely developed as walking demanded coordination between what was seen and what was anticipated. The dorsal visual stream, which interprets motion and spatial relationships, evolved to translate visual input into action, guiding limbs, adjusting balance, calculating trajectory. To see far was also to prepare the body for what was coming. Even colour vision may have played a role in this transformation. As the savannas expanded, contrast between earth, sky and vegetation intensified. Being able to distinguish shades of green, yellow and brown would have helped identify edible plants or signs of water. Early hominins likely had trichromatic vision inherited from their primate ancestors, but the way they used it changed. Colour became not just a marker of ripeness, but a map, a way to read the terrain. There's an irony in how vision evolved. By lifting the head, early humans gained clarity but also vulnerability. The horizon was full of information, but it was also full of threat. Standing tall made one visible. To look out was to be looked at. The survival strategy that came with height required not just keen eyes, but calm vigilance, a behavioural state between alertness and composure. This balance, in turn, may have influenced temperament. Evolution favours not only anatomy, but attitude. A creature too skittish wastes energy. One too slow to react dies. The upright gaze demanded equilibrium, both physical and mental. When scientists study the shape of fossil skulls, they sometimes focus on the relationship between the orbits and the brain case. In Australopithecus AFARENSIS, the orbits are large relative to skull size, hinting at strong visual processing. But the frontal lobes, while smaller than ours, already showed modest expansion, a space where perception and anticipation begin to meet. To see, in this sense, was to think. Imagine one of those early walkers scanning a landscape after rain. The light is diffused, the ground still dark with moisture. To the right, movement in the grass. To the left, the shimmer of a distant stream. The brain weighs these signals automatically. Risk, reward, direction. The act of choosing where to go next becomes a form of thought. Not yet language, but decision. Every step guided by what the eyes measured and what the mind predicted. Even today, this ancient partnership shapes how we experience the world. The way our eyes lock onto distant movement, the way we instinctively read depth and texture, the satisfaction of watching a horizon, all of it is inherited from those early moments of standing tall. The pleasure of perspective is evolutionary memory. The horizon itself became an invisible teacher. In the trees, distance is fragmented. On the plain, it is continuous. To see far is to understand that the world extends beyond the immediate. That simple awareness, that there is more out there than what is here, may have been the earliest form of wonder. It introduced scale into consciousness. For the first time, a creature could feel small against its surroundings, and yet continue walking toward them. This capacity for orientation eventually led to endurance, not only physical but mental. Seeing the horizon meant understanding direction, returning to familiar places, recognizing landmarks. Eyes became instruments of memory as much as perception. The link between vision and navigation still resides in our hippocampus today, where spatial mapping and visual input converge. What began as a way to avoid predators became the foundation for wayfinding, the ability to hold a mental image of the world beyond immediate sight. But let's stay in the mid-Pliocene before those ideas took form. Picture an Australopithecus AFARENSIS standing motionless, head tilted slightly upward, scanning the golden light of a late afternoon. In that moment, every part of its anatomy, the balanced skull, the steady spine, the depth-calculating eyes, works together to translate light into knowledge. It does not yet understand what it's doing, but evolution does. It is rehearsing awareness. The mechanics of sight, in this sense, are inseparable from the mechanics of curiosity. Once the world could be seen as continuous, the mind could begin to follow invisible paths through it. The distance between here and there became measurable, and with that came imagination, the ability to see not just what is present, but what might be possible. There's a kind of poetry in this alignment between body and perception. The same muscles that keep the head steady also hold the gaze. The same eyes that watched for danger also lingered on the horizon. In time, those eyes would study the stars, trace rivers, and paint on cave walls. But their first masterpiece was simpler, learning how to read the world through depth and distance. What makes this story humbling is that it began without intent. The eyes didn't evolve for art, science, or awe. They evolved for survival, to measure distance, detect movement, and guide the next step. Yet in doing so, they built the foundation for everything we later call awareness. The horizon became not only a feature of geography, but a metaphor for possibility. Even now, when we stand in an open field and feel drawn to look out, we're repeating a gesture millions of years old. The pleasure we take in perspective, in sunsets, mountain views, or endless sea, is the echo of that first realization that there is a world beyond reach, waiting to be understood. To see far is to remember where seeing began. A small figure standing under a wide African sky, the air still and heavy after a season without rain. Around it, the world has changed. The forest edges are thinning, the fruits have grown scarce, and the grass that once waved in golden seas has hardened to straw. The first walker bends low, searching not for shade or safety, but for food. It is around 3.3 million years ago, and hunger has become an evolutionary force. What began as a shift in anatomy, the habit of standing upright, is now reshaping behaviour, territory, and the very chemistry of life. Walking was freedom, but freedom came with a cost, a body that must feed while moving. To understand what these early Australopiths ate, we have to listen to the isotopic record written in their teeth. Within every fossilised molar, tiny ratios of carbon isotopes, the difference between carbon-13 and carbon-12, reveal the types of plants that once formed the base of their diet. These isotopes act like molecular signatures distinguishing two broad photosynthetic pathways on Earth, C3 and C4. C3 plants, which include trees, shrubs, and forest fruits, thrive in cooler, wetter conditions. C4 plants, grasses, sedges, and their derivatives, evolved to survive heat and drought. The balance between these two types in a fossil's enamel is a direct echo of landscape and diet. When scientists analysed the teeth of Australopithecus afarensis, the pattern was clear but surprising. Instead of a diet tied to forests, the carbon values showed a substantial portion of C4 input, evidence that these hominins were no longer confined to wooded environments. They were eating resources from open grasslands as well. Tough stems, seeds, roots, and perhaps the small animals that grazed among them. Their world had become an ecological patchwork, and their appetites reflected that mosaic. This versatility was not a choice made consciously, but a product of survival pressure. As the climate grew more variable during the mid-Pliocene, rainfall patterns became unpredictable. Lake cores from regions like the Turkana Basin reveal cycles of expansion and contraction, years of plenty followed by years of scarcity. In such instability, specialization was a gamble. Generalists, species that could eat almost anything, had the evolutionary advantage. Australopithecus AFARENSIS seems to have been one of them. Their jaws tell part of this story too. Broad dental arches, thick enamel, and large molars suggest adaptation to tough fibrous foods. These were not dainty fruit eaters, but pragmatic omnivores equipped to chew through whatever the season offered. Microwear analysis, microscopic scratches on tooth surfaces, shows a mix of patterns, some consistent with soft fruit, others with gritty, abrasive material like tubers or unripe seeds. It implies a flexible diet that shifted with the environment. When the forest yielded less, the plains filled the gap. Energy balance became a defining constraint. Walking upright burns calories differently than climbing or knuckle walking. The biomechanics of bipedalism are efficient over distance but require sustained intake. A creature that could travel farther could also find more, but it had to fuel that mobility. Hunger and movement became interlocked feedbacks. The farther they walked, the more they needed to eat, and the more they needed to eat, the farther they had to walk. In that sense, appetite and anatomy co-evolved, each demanding the other's persistence. It is tempting to think of these early hominins as foragers of opportunity, wandering across mixed landscapes and sampling from every niche. But isotopic data complicates that picture. Even within a single population, variability was high. Some individuals show heavier reliance on C3 plants, suggesting habitats still shaded by trees, while others tilt towards C4 sources, perhaps living closer to open plains. This diversity may indicate flexible group territories or seasonal migration between ecological zones. Instead of one perfect environment, there were shifting mosaics, gallery forests along rivers, grassy uplands, scattered woodlands. In such landscapes, survival meant knowing many ways to eat. The animal world around them was also responding to the same pressures. Herbivores were diversifying, evolving new grazing strategies to handle tougher C4 grasses. Predators followed their prey, and competition intensified. For small bipedal apes, the safest hours were dawn and dusk, times when heat and danger were both lower. These intervals shaped daily rhythm, moving out to forage early, resting through the hottest hours, returning before nightfall. Hunger was not only about what to eat, but when it was safe to look for it. Plant remains and soil isotopes from mid-Pliocene deposits tell us that edible resources were scattered rather than abundant. Ripened fruits might appear in pockets after rain. Underground tubers could be dug year-round, though with effort. Seeds, often encased in tough husks, required persistence to access. Each of these demanded different movements and postures, climbing, crouching, digging, all within the capacity of a body halfway between ape and human. That physical versatility, paired with ecological awareness, became its own form of intelligence. Hunger, in this era, was not an occasional discomfort, but a constant background condition. It trained memory and attention. To know where the next patch of edible shoots grew, or when a certain tree would fruit again, required spatial awareness across time, an understanding of place beyond the present. In that way, the search for food began to cultivate the beginnings of planning. Not planning as we know it, but the biological rhythm of anticipation. Hunger today leading to movement tomorrow. Stable isotope data also suggests that some Australopithecus individuals occasionally consumed higher trophic food, meaning they were not purely plant-based. While the evidence stops short of direct proof, trace signals hint at occasional omnivory, perhaps opportunistic feeding on insects, eggs, or small vertebrates. This would not yet be hunting, but scavenging, an extension of curiosity into the edible frontier. Each experiment added a new source of energy and nutrients, reinforcing adaptability. What's striking is that this dietary breadth appears millions of years before the first stone tools. It tells us that behavioural flexibility preceded technological innovation. These apes did not need tools to diversify their diet. Their bodies and minds were already the tools. The ability to exploit varied foods without specialisation may have been the evolutionary foundation on which all later human survival strategies were built. Modern comparisons with other primates underscore how unusual this was. Chimpanzees, for example, have narrower dietary windows, depending heavily on fruit with seasonal supplements of leaves and meat. Early hominins, by contrast, seem to have tolerated a wider range of textures and sources, enduring scarcity by shifting strategy rather than location. Their teeth were libraries of adaptation, recording a story of persistence through change. This shift in diet also altered the ecological role of hominins themselves. Instead of occupying a single niche, they became participants in multiple food webs, browsers when the trees allowed, grazers when they must, scavengers when opportunity appeared. The ground beneath their feet offered as much sustenance as the branches above once did. That expansion of ecological identity, being both part of the forest and the savannah, was one of the first steps toward what we now call humanity. There is also a chemical intimacy in this story. Every bite taken left atomic traces that we can still read today. When a leaf grows under full sunlight, it captures carbon differently than when shaded or water stressed. That difference is locked into the tissues of whoever eats it. So when we analyse a tooth from 3 million years ago, we are reading sunlight and drought, shade and distance, the daily choices of a living being translated into isotopic poetry. It is a humbling thought. Hunger recorded as chemistry, appetite as geometry within enamel. In this light, omnivory becomes less about eating everything and more about learning the landscape. Each food type carried information. A certain grass meant water nearby, a bitter tuber meant survival through drought. A fallen fruit meant the season had turned. The act of eating was also the act of understanding, decoding signals written by plants and animals long before language could name them. Over generations, such relationships between hunger and environment may have shaped behaviour in ways that bordered on culture, not in the symbolic sense, but in memory and teaching. An older individual's knowledge of edible roots or migratory cycles would have been invaluable. Those who remembered where and when food returned each year became the quiet archivists of their kind. In a world without tools or fire, knowledge itself was sustenance. It is possible that this flexible appetite also influenced social organisation. Groups that foraged widely might have needed to coordinate loosely, communicating through gestures or calls to share discoveries or warn of scarcity. Food distribution could have been communal in times of abundance and competitive during droughts. Though the evidence is silent, the logic of survival suggests that cooperation, however simple, was as old as hunger itself. In the end, what the isotopes tell us is less about what was eaten and more about what was endured. The mid-Pliocene was a world of instability, and every fluctuation in rainfall wrote itself into the biology of those who lived through it. To eat what the land offered, and to keep walking, was the essence of adaptation. Perhaps the most profound insight hidden in this record is that appetite drove exploration. The need to find food pushed early hominins to cross new territories, to test unknown paths, to expand their mental and physical maps of the world. Hunger, in that sense, was not just survival, but discovery. It turned motion into meaning. The first dialogue between body and planet. So, did walking create appetite, or did appetite create walking? The evidence, as always, resists simplicity. They evolved together, each shaping the other. To move was to search, and to search was to live. Every step across those shifting plains was powered by a hunger that followed our species home, and in some quiet way still does. Imagine this. The bones of an antelope lying half buried in red Ethiopian soil, silent for more than 3 million years. The surface looks ordinary at first, weathered, cracked, a relic of scavengers long gone. But under magnification, faint parallel lines appear, too straight, too clean to be the casual work of time. Tiny grooves, each less than a millimetre deep, run across the bone's surface like whispers of a forgotten gesture. Around 3.3 million years ago, something, or someone, made them. And for decades now, scientists have been quietly arguing about what, or who, that was. This mystery begins in Dikika, a region of ancient river deposits in the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia. In 2010, a team of paleoanthropologists reported finding a pair of fossilised bones, one from a large mammal, another from a smaller ungulate, both bearing what appeared to be cut marks. The bones were dated to roughly the same layer as Australopithecus AFARENSIS, the species of Lucy. If the marks were truly made by intentional tools, they would push the origins of stone use back by at least 800,000 years earlier than previously thought. That single claim, that the first cut of intention predated our genus, sent shockwaves through paleoanthropology. The evidence on its surface seemed tantalising. The incisions on the bones showed V-shaped cross-sections and microscopic striations consistent with the slicing motion of a sharp edge. Some marks occurred near joint surfaces, in places where meat would cling to bone. Others appeared at angles suggesting disarticulation, the deliberate separation of a limb from body. To the untrained eye, they looked indistinguishable from the butchery marks found on much later sites where tool use is undisputed. And nearby sediments contained cobbles of volcanic rock, some naturally sharp enough to cut. But science thrives on skepticism, and almost immediately alternative explanations emerged. Could such grooves have been produced naturally? In a world full of predators, bones are often gnawed, trampled or abraded by stones in moving water. The process known as taphonomy, how organisms decay and enter the fossil record, can mimic intention in surprising ways. Some researchers argued that the Dikika marks might be the product of trampling, bones pressed against sharp rocks by the hooves of passing animals. Others noted that the pattern lacked the consistency expected from deliberate cutting. Under the microscope, nature and intention often blur. A trampling mark can also be V-shaped. A tooth drag can leave parallel scratches. Even erosion over millennia can exaggerate or smooth an originally ambiguous groove into something that looks man-made. The real question was not whether sharp edges existed, but whether they were guided by thought. If the marks were indeed intentional, the implications would be profound. It would mean that Australopithecus AFARENSIS, long considered a clever ape but not a toolmaker, had not only used sharp stones but possibly recognised their usefulness for separating flesh from bone. Such behaviour would suggest a leap in cognition, the ability to connect cause and effect, to see that a stone could change the outcome of a meal. It would also hint at planning, knowing that a hard object could make food more accessible. This would not yet be technology as we understand it, but a kind of mechanical curiosity. The spark of intention flickering inside an animal still half wild. To test the hypothesis, researchers conducted experiments. They replicated the same types of marks using stone flakes on fresh bones, then compared them to the Dikika specimens under scanning electron microscopes. In many cases, the resemblance was uncanny. The depth, angle, and polish of the cuts aligned closely. But critics pointed out that the natural processes of trampling could also reproduce similar morphologies, especially under dry, abrasive conditions like those in Pliocene Ethiopia. The debate grew, as debates in paleoanthropology often do, not from disagreement over data but from interpretation. Some scientists emphasise context. The bones were found near Afarensis fossils within a known habitat range. Others noted the absence of actual tools, No confirmed flakes, cores or hammerstones at the site. Without those, they argued, the claim could not stand. It became a classic standoff between extraordinary evidence and extraordinary claims. Still, something about those bones refused to be dismissed. Their quiet precision invited the imagination to linger. What if Australopithecus afarensis did, at times, use naturally sharp stones opportunistically? Not shaping them, not preserving them, but recognizing their edge. After all, tool use in modern primates blurs similar lines. Chimpanzees crack nuts with rocks, capuchin monkeys dig with sticks, and bonobos use leaves as sponges. Behaviours that require awareness but not invention. Perhaps the Decisive marks mark the first step on that continuum. Not tool making, but tool awareness. From this perspective, the significance of Decisive lies not in proving, but in questioning. It asks where we draw the line between nature and culture, between instinct and design. A stone-cutting flesh may be as much a coincidence as a revelation, yet even coincidence can become habit if repeated often enough. Perhaps early hominins discovered by accident that certain rocks could split hide, and through repetition that act became part of their ecological repertoire. Not technology yet, but behaviour, the beginning of what could become culture. The environment itself might have encouraged such moments. By 3.3 million years ago, the African Rift Valley was a place of constant experimentation. Fluctuating climates alternated between wetter and drier periods, changing the distribution of plant and animal life. When droughts came, scavenging opportunities increased, carcasses exposed by predators or seasonal die-offs. For a bipedal omnivore with limited claws and teeth, a sharp edge, even stumbled upon, could mean the difference between bare bone and nutrition. Evolution does not require brilliance. It requires only curiosity, rewarded by survival. When paleoanthropologists revisited the Decisive bones years later with higher resolution imaging, they found both support and complication. Some marks did appear consistent with deliberate cutting, but others looked less clear. There were even traces suggesting secondary modification, perhaps from trampling after the cuts were made. The conclusion as of now remains unresolved. The bones could represent the earliest known butchery or simply a convincing accident. And yet the debate itself tells us something valuable. That scientists continue to scrutinise such tiny scratches reveals how carefully we search for the origins of intention. A millimetre-wide line can hold the weight of evolution story, a threshold between instinct and imagination. Whether Afarensis wielded a stone by design or by chance, the possibility changes how we see them. It transforms them from passive foragers into active participants in their environment, creatures beginning to manipulate the world rather than merely endure it. In the grand scale of human origins, the difference between 3.3 and 2.6 million years, when the first undisputed tools appear, may not seem vast. But in evolutionary terms, that interval could represent hundreds of thousands of generations. A long rehearsal period in which hands, eyes and brains co-adapted to the idea that objects could act as extensions of the body. The Decisive marks might be the fossilised record of that rehearsal. Even if natural, they remind us of how thin the line between accident and invention truly is. Every major step in evolution, bipedalism, language, fire, began as a series of experiments, often unnoticed at the time. The first cut, if it happened, would have been just that, a curious gesture, forgotten by the one who made it, remembered only by the bone. Standing in the present, it's easy to imagine that moment. The air thick with dust and insects, the body crouched beside a carcass, a sharp stone in hand. A slice across tough hide, a flake of skin peeling away. The motion feels different, faster, cleaner. The creature looks down, sees red against stone, and something shifts. A pattern recognised, a tool born, or perhaps just the echo of both. We may never know whether those ancient grooves were made by conscious choice or geological chance. But that uncertainty itself carries meaning. It reminds us that evolution is not a ladder of invention, but a field of experiments, some that succeed, others that fade. Somewhere in that field, 3 million years ago, an ape stood on 2 legs, reached for a stone, and left a trace deep enough for us to find. A skull no larger than a grapefruit resting in ancient sediment, its interior once filled with a brain that could fit inside your hand. For generations, scientists looked at that size and saw limitation. 440 cubic centimetres, about 1/3 of ours. Yet when you pause to think, the number tells less than the shape, and the shape tells less than the story written in its subtle curves and ridges. The mind beneath that skull was not a smaller version of ours. It was something else entirely, a bridge between instinct and awareness, between reaction and the first outlines of thought. When we study Australopithecus AFARENSIS today, we do not have its brain, only the inner surface of the bone that once held it. These fossilized cranial cavities, what researchers call endocasts, preserve faint impressions of the brain structure, like the mould left behind when a seed decays inside a shell. From those traces, we can reconstruct the rough shape of the cerebral hemispheres, the size of lobes, and even the placement of key folds and sulci. What emerges is a picture both familiar and alien. The overall brain volume, around 400 to 450 cubic centimetres, overlaps with modern chimpanzees, yet the organisation hints at a quiet reconfiguration, an early rearrangement of neural real estate that would one day make thought recursive. The frontal lobes of Afarensis show signs of slight expansion and more complex folding than those of apes, though not yet the elaborate convolutions of Homo. This region, associated in us with planning, decision-making and social regulation, may have been undergoing subtle reorganisation, a shift less in size than in wiring. Evolution does not only build new structures, it reroutes connections, changing how existing systems interact. A modest increase in cross-communication between sensory, motor and association areas could have been enough to create a fundamentally different quality of awareness, a mind that didn't just react to its surroundings, but began to integrate them over time. To appreciate what that means, imagine standing upright for the first time and seeing a world not in fragments, but in continuity. Every object, every sound, every horizon line now linked into a spatial narrative that required memory to navigate. A brain accustomed to immediate canopy life suddenly had to track routes across open space, remember landmarks, recall sources of water and food, and perhaps even recognise other individuals encountered along those paths. Such demands would have rewarded cognitive endurance, the ability to hold multiple bits of information together long enough to make choices. Inside that small skull, then, may have lived a mind optimised not for abstraction, but for persistence. Memory and perception intertwined. Each sensory cue, the smell of wet earth, the call of a bird, the shimmer of heat, carried meaning only if it could be recalled later. Neurobiologists call this working memory, and though primitive in form, it might have begun here, driven not by intellect but by survival. The temporal lobes, responsible for auditory processing and aspects of social recognition, also show intriguing hints of development. Even if Afarensis could not speak, it certainly could listen. The world it inhabited was full of calls, rustles, growls and footsteps. Sound carried through open air in ways that forest acoustics never had. Recognising subtle differences in tone, distinguishing a friend's call from a predator's, could mean life or death. This required neurons not only to detect sound but to compare it, to identify patterns across time. In that capacity, we see the beginning of cognition as pattern recognition, the neural seed of curiosity. Curiosity in turn may have emerged not as play but as vigilance. To survive in shifting environments, early hominins had to notice anomalies, a shape out of place, a rustle too sudden, a path that no longer smelled the same. Each new sense of something different became a trigger for learning. The prefrontal regions of the brain, even in their embryonic form, were learning to ask silent questions. One of the most fascinating insights from endocast research concerns the parietal lobes, the regions that integrate sensory information and map the body's relation to space. These areas appear slightly expanded in Australopithecus compared with apes, suggesting increased spatial awareness. It fits the evidence from posture and movement. A creature walking upright must constantly calculate balance, stride, and direction. To do this efficiently, the brain needs to coordinate visual input, muscle feedback, and vestibular signals. A three-way communication that demands integration rather than reflex. The parietal cortex may have been the quiet engine of that synthesis, building an internal sense of the body as a centered object within the world. In other words, the first flicker of self-location, not self-awareness, but awareness of place. If we could watch an afarensis brain in action, it might seem endlessly occupied with motion, tracking movement across open ground, navigating social proximity within a group, watching the wind ripple through tall grass for signs of danger. Yet within that constant flow, neurons were rehearsing something profound, holding mental models of change, comparing present input to remembered patterns. That recursive comparison, this now versus that before, is the essence of what we later call thought. The small size of the brain did not preclude complexity. In fact, energy constraints may have demanded efficiency. Modern humans have large, metabolically expensive brains, but early hominins could not yet afford such costs. Their solution was not to think more, but to think better within limits, streamlining neural pathways to reduce redundancy. Efficiency itself can generate sophistication. Fewer neurons firing in more coordinated ways can create emergent intelligence. Endocasts also hint at asymmetry, meaning the left and right hemispheres were no longer perfectly mirrored. This lateralization, seen in modern humans as specialization for language and fine motor control, may have begun as an evolutionary experiment in division of labour within the brain. Even a slight bias, one hemisphere handling spatial tasks, the other managing movement, would have improved coordination and adaptability. From such tiny differences, the architecture of later human cognition would unfold. But what might it have felt like from the inside? Consciousness at that stage would have been largely sensory, a vivid present rather than a reflective one. The past existed only as impressions, the future as learned expectation. Yet within that immediacy, emotion and memory were already interwoven. To recognise another individual, to recall a path, to seek shelter, all required affective context, the feeling that something matters. Emotional memory, supported by deep limbic structures, likely played a central role in shaping behaviour long before rational thought existed. In this sense, empathy too may have roots older than intellect. Observations of modern great apes show social bonds, grief, and cooperation without symbolic language. Australopithecus AFARENSIS lived in groups, and though we lack direct evidence of social structure, the ecological logic is clear. Cooperative vigilance and shared offspring care increase survival odds. Such coordination requires recognition of individuals, relationships, and roles. A brain wired for social memory would naturally develop capacities for understanding others' actions and intentions. To glimpse that ancient social mind, imagine a small group resting at dusk. The day's heat fades, the wind cools, and each member finds a spot within reach of the others. The brain of one, drowsy yet alert, notes proximity, hears familiar breathing patterns, feels security in numbers. These are not words or thoughts, but states of awareness mapped onto physiology, the neurological comfort of belonging. From that comfort would later emerge the cognitive scaffolding of trust, empathy, and eventually cooperation, even curiosity that most human of traits likely began as an extension of vigilance, a flicker in the grass, an unfamiliar sound, a new smell. These stimuli triggered attention not for pleasure, but for safety. Yet attention, once stabilized by repetition, becomes learning. The brain learns that observation itself yields reward. That simple shift from reacting to noticing might have been the dawn of sustained awareness. We often measure intelligence by brain volume, but evolution measures it by adaptability. A small brain that enables survival in changing conditions is more successful than a large one that cannot cope. Australopithecus AFARENSIS occupied varied habitats, from woodland margins to open savannas, suggesting behavioural flexibility. Its brain, though small, was likely tuned to environmental complexity, capable of switching strategies, remembering seasonal cycles, and modifying habits. In those capacities, the architecture of cognition was being drafted neuron by neuron. Some paleoanthropologists now suggest that the true hallmark of early human intelligence was not tool-making or communication, but attention, to sustain focus across time and context. To pay attention is to filter reality, to choose what matters, to connect one moment to the next. The neural networks supporting that act, involving the prefrontal cortex, parietal association areas, and limbic regulation, were already beginning to coordinate in these small-brained ancestors. From attention grows pattern, from pattern, prediction, from prediction, meaning. Perhaps the most humbling aspect of studying afarensis cognition is realizing how much of our own mind remains built upon theirs. The way we navigate space, form routines, interpret motion, or feel unease in open ground, all are echoes of neural solutions refined long before we appeared. Their brains were not primitive versions of ours, but prototypes of possibility. Each synaptic connection they formed, each behaviour reinforced by success, became part of the inheritance we still carry. So was thought small? Not exactly. It was focused, immediate, embodied. It saw the world through movement and sensation rather than abstraction. The mind beneath that skull was learning to integrate, to anticipate, to remember, to live in time, if not yet beyond it. And somewhere in that small brain, across a network of glowing connections, curiosity was already sparking. A quiet biological rhythm that, over millions of years, would grow into wonder. Imagine this. A small child, barely 3 years old, lies still beneath the sediments of a river delta that no longer exists. Her bones are light as memory, her ribs curved like the petals of a fossilized flower. Around her are traces of an ancient flood, ash and silt hardened into stone. She died young, perhaps drowned, perhaps swept away, yet her story would survive longer than any that followed her. Found millions of years later near the Awash River in Ethiopia, she became known to us as the Dikika child, or Selam, peace, in the local language. But what she truly preserved was not peace, nor tragedy, but time itself, the pace at which childhood began to change. Around 3.2 million years ago, life for Australopithecus afarensis was already a fragile balance of adaptation and vulnerability. They had mastered upright walking, exploited new habitats, and diversified their diet. Yet one of the most subtle revolutions was happening within, in the rhythm of how they grew. For every evolutionary gain in locomotion or cognition, there was a biological cost, longer dependency, slower maturity, and greater need for care. To raise a walker was to invent patience. The Dikika child gives us a rare glimpse into this transitional biology. Her skeleton, discovered in 2000 by Zeresene Alemzeged and his team, is the most complete juvenile hominin ever found. Every rib, finger bone, and tiny vertebra tells a story of growth caught between ape and human. CT scans of her skull reveal unerupted adult teeth, allowing scientists to estimate her age, about 3 years at death, and to infer her developmental rate. Her dentition suggests that Afarensis matured faster than modern humans, but slower than chimpanzees, following an intermediate schedule. Childhood, it seems, was beginning to stretch in chimpanzees. Infancy is brief. The first permanent molars emerge around 3 years, and by age 6 independence is well underway. Humans, by contrast, experience a prolonged childhood, with molars arriving closer to 6 years and full maturity delayed for more than a decade. This difference isn't merely cultural, it reflects neurological investment. Longer childhood allows more time for the brain to wire itself through experience. The Decisive child's pattern implies that this elongation was already underway, that evolution was experimenting with slower growth to accommodate a changing brain and lifestyle. Her skull reinforces that idea. Endocranial volume at her age was roughly 330 cubic centimetres, about 75% of adult Afarensis size. By comparison, a modern human child at 3 years has reached only about 60% of adult brain volume. This means that Afarensis brains grew more rapidly early on, finishing much of their development sooner, but possibly continuing behavioural refinement afterward. It is a hybrid pattern. The fast start of an ape, the prolonged refinement of a human. Even her posture reflects this balance. The curvature of her vertebrae and the angle of her knee joints show that she was already walking upright, though likely less efficiently than adults. But her long arms and curved fingers remind us she still climbed easily, perhaps sleeping in trees for safety. Childhood, for her species, was not yet grounded. Each day was a negotiation between two worlds, the forest canopy of instinct and the open savanna of innovation. The shape of her pelvis, reconstructed from fragments, adds another layer to this story. For mothers, upright walking had imposed a new constraint, the birth canal. A pelvis optimized for bipedal locomotion narrowed the space through which infants were born, even as brain size gradually increased. This created what evolutionary anthropologists call the obstetric dilemma, the trade-off between walking efficiently and giving birth safely. For Afarensis, this compromise was already present, though less severe than in modern humans. Pelvic evidence suggests that infants were still small enough at birth to pass through with relative ease, but their heads grew quickly afterward, demanding sustained postnatal care. That dependency would have shaped every aspect of social life. A mother carrying an infant could not forage as widely or as quickly. Others in the group likely shared vigilance or helped transport offspring. Even without direct evidence, the physics of care imply cooperation. A child who could not cling continuously, as ape infants do, required arms willing to lift and hold. The act of carrying, made possible by free hands, may have reinforced bonds between adult and young, both emotional and biological. The bones of the Decisive child's shoulder blades reveal something extraordinary. They are more similar to those of gorillas or orangutans than to modern humans. This suggests powerful climbing muscles, perhaps retained from an earlier ancestry. Yet her inner ear, the organ of balance, shows adaptations consistent with upright posture. These contradictions within one small body capture evolution in motion, a creature perfectly suited for a world that was changing beneath its feet. Her hyoid bone, the delicate structure in the throat that supports the tongue and larynx, is also preserved, the oldest ever found. Its shape indicates that Afarensis lacked the vocal flexibility of later humans, but the ability to produce a range of sounds was likely already increasing. Communication, even if still simple, was probably part of child rearing, soothing, warning, guiding. The first gestures of teaching may have begun here, long before language, a hand pointing toward danger, a sound meaning stay close. dental microstructure, the microscopic layers in teeth, provides another clock for growth. When analysed under polarised light, these lines reveal daily increments of enamel formation, like rings in a tree. The Decisive child's teeth show a pace of development faster than ours but slower than apes, confirming that she was halfway through a longer childhood experiment. Each layer records diet, health and stress. Together they show that her early years were biologically intense. The world was not gentle to small primates who stood up too soon. If we try to imagine what her life might have felt like, it was probably a blend of constant sensory learning and vigilance. Every rustle meant potential danger. Every scent was a message. Her group, likely composed of several adults and juveniles, moved with seasonal rhythm following water and edible plants. The young observed, mimicked, and learned through action, not instruction. Play, a universal form of mammalian learning, would have been vital. Through mock climbing, chasing, and balancing, children rehearsed the skills that survival required. Such play may also have served neurological function. In modern primates, play stimulates neural plasticity, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, the same region evolving rapidly during this era. The energy invested in youthful exploration might have been evolution's way of sculpting adaptable minds. To grow slowly was to learn deeply. There is an emotional gravity to this. Prolonged dependency means greater risk, a longer period of vulnerability to predation, starvation, or separation. Yet it also creates more opportunity for connection. The slow-growing child becomes not a burden, but a shared project, extending cooperation beyond instinct. In this way, biology itself began to encourage empathy. Still, childhood was not protected as we know it. Mortality rates were high. Few likely lived past adolescence. But each generation that stretched its youth by even a few months passed on the genetic and social advantages of extended care. Over thousands of lifetimes, those months became years, and the fragile lengthening of infancy evolved into the human hallmark of protracted development. The Decisive child's preservation gives us a snapshot within that transformation. Her small face, reconstructed from delicate bone, shows a short jaw and reduced snout, already trending toward the flatter profile of later humans. Her eyes, if we could meet them, would have been large and forward-facing, framed by a growing brain learning how to see the world in continuity rather than fragments. Within her, the evolutionary experiment of childhood was well underway. Less instinct, more memory, less reaction, more learning. When we look at her now, encased in stone and displayed under glass, it is tempting to call her human. But that word, with all its weight, belongs to the future. What she was, and what her kind represented, was the beginning of the idea that intelligence could grow slower and last longer, that awareness could be nurtured rather than inherited. The Rift Valley, where she lived and died, was both cradle and crucible. It fractured not only the land but the timelines of growth, forcing species to adapt to cycles of change. In that unstable world, the slow learners thrived, those whose young could absorb instability and still find rhythm within it. If you imagine her final moment, a small body washed into sediment, preserved by chance, it is less a tragedy than a message. She reminds us that evolution's most powerful inventions often hide in quiet transitions. A child who walked upright but still clung to her mother carried the blueprint for everything that would come after: cooperation, patience, and the long unfolding of mind. Her bones, now fossilized, speak to us across 3 million years, that growing slowly, depending deeply, and learning constantly were not weaknesses but the foundations of our species. The first walkers were also the first to wait. Imagine this. The rain comes harder than usual, thick and sudden, falling on the Rift Valley until the dry gullies swell into rivers. The ground, already fractured by heat, collapses under its own weight. Mud slides down the slope, dragging branches, bones and bodies into a basin that, over time, will become stone. To the creatures caught in it, the storm is an ending. To us, millions of years later, it is the beginning of memory. Fossilization is, at its heart, an accident that endures. Every skeleton from Australopithecus AFARENSIS that we know today, Lucy, the Dikika child, the fragments from Hadar, Laetoli and elsewhere, survived because death found balance with geology. The record of life is written by disaster. When paleontologists unearth a fossil, what they truly discover is a conversation between biology and physics, the choreography of how a body becomes sediment, the position of bones, the texture of surrounding matrix, even the angle of a limb frozen in time all tell of the moment after motion stopped. A life ends, gravity begins its quiet work. Within hours, the soft tissues collapse. Within days, scavengers and insects disarticulate what was once whole, but occasionally chance intervenes. A flood, a volcanic ashfall, or a rapid burial in river sediment shields the remains from scavengers and decay. It is this unlikely chain, death, burial, stillness, mineral replacement, that allows us to read lives long gone. In the Pliocene landscapes of East Africa, preservation often began in water. The same lakes and rivers that sustained early hominins also entombed them. The Hadar Formation, where Lucy was found, was once a floodplain, an ever-changing mosaic of channels and ponds. Seasonal rains could transform calm meadows into torrents overnight. When sediment-rich water covered a body, it sealed oxygen away, halting decomposition. Over thousands of years, minerals like silica and calcium carbonate infiltrated the bones, replacing organic material molecule by molecule. The result? Not a relic of bone, but a stone copy of it, the echo of anatomy. Yet every fossil is imperfect. Erosion, compression, and geological distortion erase details, leaving fragments that must be assembled like a jigsaw puzzle without a reference image. When Lucy was discovered in 1974, her skeleton was found scattered across several square meters, partly articulated but incomplete. The arrangement suggested that she died near a shallow channel, her body washed and repositioned by water currents before final burial. The state of her ribs and limbs indicated post-mortem disturbance, gentle transport rather than violent flow. In her bones we see not only her species, but the river that carried her. The Dikika child, preserved 3 million years earlier in nearby sediments, tells a different story. Her tiny skeleton was remarkably intact. Skull, ribs, fingers, and even parts of the spine connected in anatomical order. Such preservation requires extraordinary conditions, rapid burial, fine-grained sediment, and minimal disturbance. Geological analysis shows she was likely covered by a sudden flood or debris flow, perhaps while sleeping or trapped near a riverbank. The flood that ended her life protected her from time itself. In that sense, the violence of nature became her preservation. These patterns, partial scattering, full articulation, mineral replacement, reveal more than circumstance. They map the ancient environments in which Afarensis lived and died. In Hadar, layered sediments alternate between lacustrine clays and volcanic tuffs, marking oscillations between wet and dry phases. The ash layers, formed from distant eruptions, carry microcrystals that can be radiometrically dated, allowing precise reconstruction of timelines. Each burial event corresponds to a particular ecological moment: floods expanding during wet periods, collapses during droughts. Death became data. Taphonomy, the study of how organisms decay and fossilize, allows scientists to reverse engineer these stories. Under the microscope, the surfaces of bones record interactions long after life ends. Tiny grooves from water transport, bite marks from scavengers, root etchings from growing vegetation. In Afarensis fossils, we sometimes find small punctures from ancient carnivores, likely saber-tooths or hyenas. The bones tell of a precarious existence at the edge of predator ranges. In some cases, partial skeletons suggest individuals who fell prey while moving between forest and plain, the danger of being caught between two ecosystems. What's remarkable is how few afarensis individuals we actually have, given the hundreds of thousands that must have lived. Fossilization probability is infinitesimal. Most who lived vanished without trace, recycled into soil or devoured. The handful preserved represent statistical miracles, the brief moments when biology and geology aligned perfectly. We reconstruct entire species from coincidences. Volcanic activity also played a crucial role. The Rift Valley was a restless landscape shaped by uplift and eruptions. Ashfalls blanketed entire regions, creating fine sediment that both suffocated and preserved. The Letoli site, famous for footprints, owes its survival to a layer of volcanic ash dampened by rain, soft enough to capture impressions then quickly harden by drying. Similar ash layers sealed skeletal remains, protecting them from erosion. The same forces that destroyed forests recorded their inhabitants for eternity. Each fossil site offers a different taphonomic signature, a different way of dying and being remembered. At Hadar, river deposition dominates. At Letoli, ash and wind. At Dikika, floodplain burial. Together they outline a species that lived close to instability, always near water and always near danger. The rift was both cradle and grave. Its shifting topography and climatic cycles made it a place of abundance and risk, a landscape that tested every adaptation evolution could devise. Taphonomy also teaches humility. The positions of bones we see today may reflect not how an individual lived, but how sediment moved. A leg bent backward might be a product of current, not struggle. A missing skull may have rolled downstream. Scientists must learn to distinguish life signals from geological noise, a task requiring both forensic precision and imagination. Every fossil reconstruction is, in part, an act of translation, reading Earth like a language half erased by time. What makes this process so powerful is how it merges tragedy with continuity. Each buried body became part of the very soil that would later preserve others. Layers of sediment represent not only different eras but cumulative memory, thousands of generations of floods, droughts, and lives overlapping invisibly. The Rift Valley holds them all in its tilted strata, a slow archive of existence written by pressure and chance. Sometimes the details preserved are hauntingly intimate. In a few afarensis fossils, ribs show fine fractures consistent with falls from height, perhaps from climbing trees. Others reveal healed injuries, suggesting individuals who survived trauma long enough to recover. These traces remind us that the landscape's dangers were not abstract. Falls, predators, sudden storms. To live was to balance constantly between stability and collapse. To die was often to fall into the rhythm of erosion. There is even poetry in the chemistry of fossilization. As groundwater percolates through buried bone, minerals crystallize in microscopic pores. Over millennia, calcium phosphate turns to stone, yet the original structure, the pattern of collagen fibers, the internal scaffolding, remains visible under scanning microscopes. What we hold in museums today is both natural and artificial, life transformed into geology. The bones of afarensis are as much part of the Earth's crust as the volcanic rock that entombs them. In that sense, every discovery is a reunion. When scientists brush away sediment from a fossil, they are uncovering not just anatomy, but the ancient physics of death. They read the angles of collapse, the direction of water flow, the grain of ash, each detail a clue to how balance was lost. Over millions of years, the rift itself has tilted, eroded and opened, bringing these remains back to light. The land that once buried them now exhumes them. It is humbling to realize that without these deaths we would know almost nothing about early humanity. Extinction, preservation, and discovery form a chain that knowledge depends upon. Each fossil, in its silence, becomes a teacher. From the way it lies, we infer landscapes. From the mineral that replaces it, we infer climate. From its absence, we infer the fragility of record. And yet, despite all this data, the personal moment, the last breath, the final movement, remains unknowable. Was Lucy standing or climbing when she fell? Did the Dakika child sleep through the flood that covered her? Did others watch and scatter? The sediment answers only halfway, but perhaps that uncertainty is part of the lesson. The fossils remind us that life is shaped not only by adaptation, but by accident, by the unpredictable physics that turns tragedy into memory. The Rift Valley continues to shift even now. New layers are being built atop the old, new rivers carving paths over buried bones. Future scientists, if any remain, will find traces of us in similar ways, scattered, mineralized, incomplete. Fossilization will continue as long as Earth does, transforming endings into evidence. So when we study the deaths of Afarensis, we are not only reconstructing their fate, we are glimpsing the beginning of a balance that still governs us, between loss and learning, between erosion and remembrance. The Earth keeps what it destroys, and sometimes it teaches through silence. Imagine this. The same rift that once gave birth to the first walkers now begins to dry. The lakes shrink. The green mosaic of woodland and grass thins into dust. Rivers retreat into deeper channels, carving new paths through ancient layers that once held footprints and bones. Clouds drift higher, rain grows rarer, and the air takes on the still, sharp clarity of distance. Around 2.9 million years ago, the Earth itself begins to cool, and with that cooling, Africa's landscapes change their rules. What had been an experiment in balance, forest and savanna, tree and ground, ape and human, starts to tilt. Not abruptly, not cruelly, but steadily. Evolution is not an ending, it is an inheritance. The record written in sediment and isotope tells this shift with geological precision. Oxygen isotope data from marine cores off East Africa reveal a progressive global cooling beginning just before 3 million years ago, the onset of a climatic descent that would eventually lead to the ice ages. In the tropics, this meant drying rather than freezing. Monsoon cycles weakened, rainfall patterns fractured. The great East African lakes, once stable refuges, began to fluctuate wildly, expanding in wet phases and evaporating in droughts. It was a time of volatility, of boom and bust, the Earth rehearsing the climate instability that would shape every hominin to come. For Australopithecus afarensis, this was both a challenge and a legacy. Their world, which had supported mixed feeding, arboreal refuge and long-distance walking, was fragmenting. Open grasslands expanded while forests withdrew into isolated pockets. The mosaic ecology that once favoured adaptability began to demand specialisation. Where some populations followed shrinking woodlands, others ventured further into open country. In the sediment, their fossils fade out gradually, not in catastrophe but in diffusion. The line of Afarensis doesn't vanish so much as dissolve into descendants and neighbours. The land that had raised them was still active. The rift continued to tear itself apart, deepening valleys and uplifting plateaus. Volcanic eruptions reshaped drainage systems, creating new habitats while erasing old ones. Ash layers from these eruptions still blanket East Africa today, each a page in the story of deep time. Within those pages, paleosols, ancient buried soils, preserve chemical signatures of vegetation. Around the end of the Afarensis era, these soils show an increasing dominance of C4 plant isotopes. Grasses and sedges adapted to dryness. The forest that had once filtered light into gentle green shadows now gave way to the gold glare of open plains. In such openness, life diversified again. Herbivores evolved tougher teeth for grazing, carnivores refined their endurance for pursuit. For early hominins, this meant the landscape itself became a test of range. Who could travel farthest, tolerate longest, and adapt quickest? The walkers of Hadar and Laetoli had already proven that upright motion was efficient. Now that adaptation would be passed down as inheritance, no longer just advantageous, but essential. The Rift Valley, once their cradle, became their crucible. Fossil sites that post-date Afarensis show both continuity and divergence. In some regions, later Australopiths appear, more robust forms with heavier jaws and specialised diets. In others, lighter builds and more refined postures suggest experimentation toward endurance and exploration. But these are stories for later. What matters here is that Afarensis lived at the hinge of transformation, the point where ecological stress stopped being a threat and started becoming a teacher. Their evolutionary success was not in perfection but in flexibility. They taught the lineage that survival would depend not on what you were, but on how you changed. Even the air carried clues to this transition. As global temperatures declined, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels fell, lowering plant productivity and altering food webs. The lush rift of Lucy's time began to echo with wind rather than bird song. Sediment cores show increased dust deposition, proof of expanding aridity. The same dust that once coated their footprints would, over millennia, drift into the oceans and settle on seabeds, preserving the story of their world's thinning breath. What's remarkable is that Afarensis endured through much of this change. For hundreds of thousands of years after the climate began to cool, their fossils still appear across East Africa, at Hadar, Makkah, and beyond. They adapted not through invention, but resilience. Their physiology, strong legs, flexible diet, social bonds, allowed them to persist as other species faltered. If extinction finally came, it was not failure but succession, the quiet transfer of endurance to those who would follow. The rift itself preserves this lineage of adaptation. Its walls expose strata that record every ecological pulse: volcanic ash, floodplain clay, fossilized roots. Each layer is a moment of inheritance. When rain returned after drought, it filled lakes that reflected not only clouds but history. Water that once dissolved the bones of one generation nourished the grass for the next. Evolution, in that sense, was not linear but circular, always recycling matter and chance. If we could stand on that land at the moment Afarensis faded from view, we might not notice their absence. The same footsteps would still mark the same riverbanks. The same winds would still move through acacias. But the rhythm of life would have changed. Infants grew in smaller groups, adults travelled farther, and the calls of predators carried longer across thinner air. The Earth was teaching scarcity, and scarcity in turn was teaching foresight. Geologists studying the rift today can still trace the exact sedimentary layers that bridge Afarensis to what comes next. The texture of those layers, coarse or fine, oxidized or grey, reveals whether the world was wet or dry, violent or calm. They show that climate oscillations became faster, less predictable. Seasons blurred. This acceleration of environmental instability was the great shaper of later evolution. It didn't end Afarensis. It sculpted the minds and bodies that would inherit their place. From an evolutionary viewpoint, there is no single line of descent, only networks of survival. Some Afarensis populations likely gave rise to later forms, others branched off and ended quietly, leaving no successors. Yet in all cases their legacy persisted in bone structure, locomotion and ecology. Every species that later walked upright owed its balance to the rift's shifting ground. Every stride we take today is a repetition of that early experiment in motion. Even their disappearance tells us something profound about continuity. Extinction, in the deep time sense, is not a moment but a gradient. Species fade as environments evolve. In the rift, erosion itself ensures that nothing truly ends. Fossils exposed become dust again, re-entering the soil, feeding new cycles. The rift teaches that survival and disappearance are both forms of participation in Earth's metabolism. By 2.5 million years ago, Africa's climate was cooler, its grasslands dominant, its forests retreating. The stage was set for new adaptations, longer legs, larger brains, new ways of finding and sharing food. But those possibilities were built on the bones of Afarensis. Their success had proven the viability of walking, of generalism, of persistence. Their inheritance was not genetic alone, but ecological, a landscape redefined by their passage. In the rift today you can still see that inheritance. The same escarpments where their fossils rest rise above modern riverbeds carved by the same geologic forces. Dust storms still roll across the same basins, carrying the same minerals that once preserved them. The air still smells faintly of volcanic ash after rain. Every feature of that terrain, every cliff, every dry lake, is a fossil of their time. If you look closely at the stratigraphy, you notice that the layers marking the end of Afarensis are not sudden or chaotic. They are smooth transitions, silts gradually giving way to sands, wetland clay thinning into loess. The record does not speak of extinction, but of continuity through transformation. The rift simply changed its rhythm, and life adapted its tempo. Perhaps that is the real inheritance, not the bones, but the balance. Australopithecus AFARENSIS did not conquer its world. It learned to move with it. As the rift opened wider and the climate hardened, they left behind the most valuable trait of all, the ability to endure change. The walkers of 3 million years ago may be gone, but the pattern they began, curiosity in motion, resilience through adaptation, still shapes every step we take. When the wind moves through the rift at dusk, it passes over the same plains that once held their prints. It whispers through sediments that remember them not as fossils, but as part of the Earth's own long breath. The rift keeps their story not as tragedy, but as inheritance, the rhythm of balance carried forward through time. Imagine this. Every time you stand up, you reenact a decision made 4 million years ago. It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't heroic. Somewhere on the Rift Valley floor, an ape-like creature simply shifted its weight and never entirely went back to the trees. That moment, small, unrecorded, unintentional, changed the geometry of existence. To stand upright was to tilt the axis of life itself. The horizon widened. The hands were freed. The skull balanced on the spine like a planet finding orbit. From that day forward, gravity stopped being just a force that pulled. It became a teacher. The first walker didn't know it, but their body had begun writing the choreography of our entire lineage. Standing up changed everything, yet it left no monument, only echoes. The line of bones, pelvis, and vertebrae that defines our posture today is an inheritance of balance refined over millions of quiet adjustments. It's easy to think of walking as trivial, a mechanical act, a rhythm so familiar it disappears into the background of daily life. But every stride is a negotiation with physics, a contract renewed with the earth beneath us. To walk upright is to live in tension, between falling and catching, between surrender and control. Evolution solved that equation not with genius, but with persistence. Bipedalism didn't appear because the world demanded grace, it appeared because survival demanded efficiency. The Rift Valley was shifting, forests fragmenting, food scattered. To move between patches of safety and sustenance meant covering ground with less effort. Over generations, bodies bent to the new logic of distance. Spine curvature evolved to counterbalance the head. Pelvises shortened and broadened to bear weight, and tendons in the legs became springs that stored and released energy like clockwork. This biomechanical masterpiece, forged without intention, became the blueprint for every journey we've ever taken. Yet the physical change was only the beginning. Once upright, the view changed. The eyes lifted from the immediate, the bark, the branch, the fruit, to the horizon. That shift in perspective may be the most important evolutionary event of all. To see far is to imagine far. A horizon doesn't just show where you are, it suggests where you might go. From that elevation came the possibility of anticipation, of thought projected forward in time. Bipedalism didn't just move bodies across space, it moved minds into the future. Our inner ears still remember that balance. Inside each of us, tiny semicircular canals record the rotation of our heads, evolved for the perpetual adjustments of an upright body. Every step still depends on the same ancient reflexes, the same dialogue between muscle and gravity. Even our sense of calm, that strange peace we find in rhythm, in walking long distances, in pacing when thinking, is an echo of that original adaptation. The act of walking may be the oldest form of meditation our species knows. There's something humble about this origin. No triumph, no plan, just a quiet negotiation with a changing world. A creature learned to fall more slowly, and in that falling discovered stability. From that stability came motion, and from motion came understanding. When we talk about consciousness, we usually look to the brain, to abstract reasoning and language. But maybe awareness began lower, in the feet, in the spine, in the rhythm of standing up against wind and slope. To balance is to feel the world directly. To stand is to sense its pull and answer with resistance. Even now our bodies betray that ancestry. When we stand still too long, our posture falters, our backs ache, our necks tilt forward. Gravity reminds us that balance was never a permanent victory, only a skill renewed moment by moment. The first walker carried the same vulnerability. They were not built perfectly for standing. They were built imperfectly enough to keep adjusting. And that adjustment, that ongoing negotiation, is what made endurance possible. The Rift Valley, that long scar of tectonic tension, forged the same pattern into the land itself. Continents drifted, crusts stretched, mountains rose and eroded. The earth learned to balance through motion too. Perhaps it's no coincidence that the birthplace of upright walking was also the place where the planet itself refused to stay still. Every plate movement beneath Africa echoed the same restless experiment above it, an experiment in equilibrium. To stand upright is to be halfway between earth and sky. The posture itself carries symbolism older than any language. It is the geometry of awareness, the vertical line that connects ground to mind. When the first walker lifted their gaze, they were doing more than surviving. They were beginning the slow awakening of perspective, an understanding that the world extended beyond the immediate. Each step since has been a continuation of that realization. Every road, every migration, every wanderer following curiosity into the unknown, all trace back to that primal balance between seeing and moving. Scientists still debate exactly why and how bipedalism took hold, whether it was driven by climate shifts, energy efficiency, or social adaptation. The truth may be simpler and more profound. It worked. It allowed continuity in an unstable world. The proof of its success is not in fossils, but in the fact that you are listening to this, your skeleton still shaped by the rift's design. You're a biomechanical descendant of balance, a walking memory of ancient compromise. And yet, in all its practicality, walking remains strangely poetic. It is both freedom and burden, a reminder that to move forward requires falling even briefly into instability. Each step is an act of faith that the ground will meet you again. 4 million years ago, that faith was instinctive. Today, it has become metaphor. We talk about walking toward goals, toward meaning, toward truth. But perhaps we are only continuing what began in that distant savannah, movement as understanding. When anthropologists study fossilized footprints, they read them as data, stride length, gait, hip rotation. But those same impressions can also be read as sentences in the first story of motion. The Laterly trackway, those silent steps pressed into volcanic ash nearly 4 million years ago, is not just evidence, it's a message. 3 individuals walked across soft ground, And in doing so, they wrote the first chapter of what it means to move through time. We can measure the distance between their heels, but not the distance between that moment and now. Yet every time we walk, we bridge it. Think of your own stride. The gentle sway of weight, the lift of the heel, the rotation of the pelvis, the slight counter-movement of the arms. Every part of that motion was once an evolutionary gamble, an untested combination of physics and anatomy. And it still works. Across uneven ground, against gravity, through fatigue and thought, the same pattern endures. The first walker may be gone, but their decision lingers in the architecture of your spine, in the rhythm of your breath, in the pull of your centre of gravity. What we inherited from them is not dominance, but persistence. They didn't master balance, they became it. And maybe that's what consciousness itself is. Balance extended into thought. A mind that can hold opposites without falling, a self that can remain upright in uncertainty. If walking taught anything, it was that forward motion doesn't require certainty, only rhythm. The next time you stand on uneven ground, feel how your body recalibrates. Micro movements in your feet, your back, your neck. Those corrections are 4 million years old. They are the living echo of the rift's inheritance, an unbroken line of adjustment stretching from volcanic plains to this exact moment. The step still echoes, not in sound but in geometry. Every human silhouette, upright, balanced, in motion, is a monument to that first experiment. And perhaps that is enough. The first walker did not know what walking was. They didn't foresee that standing upright would change the course of life, or that millions of years later descendants would look back and name them Australopithecus AFARENSIS. They only knew the feel of the ground beneath their feet, the pull of horizon and wind. And that was enough to begin everything. Somewhere, in the stillness of dusk, when you pause between steps, you can almost feel that connection, not as nostalgia, but as physics. Gravity holds us the same way it held them. The earth turns beneath us as it did beneath them. The step that began in the rift still travels forward through every stride we take. Evolution never stopped walking. It just kept going quietly, persistently into the present. And as always, stay curious, stay calm,